check over on YouTube once we're started. Okay, YouTube is saying we're live. Let me check over on the chat and make sure chat is confirming that we're live. I like to get the confirmation from them so I'm not just yammering alone to you, but it should be coming any minute. Come on, chat. Tell me when you see us. Ah, there we go. Okay, my thing just had a delay. Hello, welcome, everybody, to my channel. This is Guts Gibbon. My name is Erica. I'm your gentle and, of course, very modern host tonight. I'm super excited for this project that we're hopefully about to embark on, because it does feel like a bit of a journey, I think, that we're about to set foot on this boat of knowledge and make our way across a pretty large subject that Will Duffy, my guest today, has agreed to go on with me. And I'm super excited for that, because those of you who have been in this space of internet discourse for long enough probably know it's very rare that someone subjects themselves to an opinion that isn't their own like this. I think that takes a lot of guts. And so I feel so lucky to be the person that's getting to do this with Will here today. For those of you who don't know, or maybe tuning in, haven't read the description, don't feel bothered about things like that, what we're going to do here, or what we're going to be doing today, and then for subsequent episodes, assuming we get to do those, is I'm going to be pitching evolutionary theory to Will. And I'm going to be doing that essentially by using an adapted version of the class that I taught for 4 years as ETA at my university, and then as an instructor at my university. So this is sort of going to be a hybrid of evolutionary theory generally and introduction to biological anthropology. We're going to have one lecture every month for as long as it takes. And I'm gonna pitch it to Will and see what he thinks. The goal here is to convince him, bring him over to our side, boys. I'm kidding. The goal is to teach Will what evolutionary theory is, and why people have a lot of confidence in it. At the end of all of this, it is my hope, of course, that Will is like, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And I am totally down with all of that. All of that science is good and fine by me. But I'm not under the delusion that that's going to happen. Biologists much greater than I have attempted with people before. The famous Stephen Jay Gould had Kurt Wise, who was a young Earth creationist, as a student. And Kurt Wise is still a young Earth creationist. So I wouldn't imagine myself to be some kind of incredible rhetorician, I think that's a word, capable of convincing anybody of my ideas. But I get the vibe from Will that he's here to learn about this concept, and whether he walks away from it buying it or not, that's his prerogative. So what my job is to do here is to teach it to him. What we're going to do is go through a PowerPoint, like I said, one per month, and Will's going to ask questions when and where he has them. You, as the audience, are here to enjoy that and ask questions of Will and I if you like. The way you can do that is by sending in a super chat. Super chat revenue is going to be split between Will and I, and I'm going to read every super chat that we get as of now. If they start coming in like mega ultra fast, I'll have to put a cap on it, because we won't have all night to do this. Obviously, as much as I would love to keep Will here for 8 hours, this isn't that kind of stream. I'll read all the super chats, assuming they are like not snarky and rude. I'm not going to read snarky and rude super chats. Will's here out of his own time to learn a concept with somebody who teaches it professionally. That, as I said earlier, takes a lot of guts. And so I'm not going to be reading anything that's going to put him down for that. You can disagree with Will on any or all of what he believes. You're welcome to voice that in the chat, but I'm not gonna be reading super chats about that. So with that, I think the housekeeping stuff is finished. Will has a presentation that he wants to give us an idea of where he's coming from, why he's doing this. I've not seen it, so I'm actually excited to hear him on this. I think that that's going to sort of play a role moving forward in how we do this project as well, right? Because this the nice thing about doing like an adapted course and doing it online on the internet in front of a bunch of people with only 2 people is that you can change it where and whenever you need to, focuses and things of that nature. So with that, Will, welcome. Thanks for listening to my opening spiel.
Yes, thanks, Erica. I'm really glad to be here. Now, for those of you who don't know me, which is probably most of you, my name is Will Duffy. I live in Colorado, and I'm best known as the creator of the final experiment, also known as TFE. TFE was a way to show flat earthers that they were wrong and that we indeed live on a globe. Now, I devised the experiment myself and also paid for it with my own money. And we took flat earthers to Antarctica to show them that there is a 24-hour sun in the south, just like the north, as a globe has north-south symmetry. Now, this whole endeavor gained a lot of traction. It ended up talked about internationally. People started signing up to go with us, either paying for themselves or raising money to go. And we actually ended up with a group of 9 people, 4 flat earthers, 4 on the side of the globe, and then also myself. Now, I learned a lot through that entire experience, which ended up as a 2-year project. And it's actually because of TFE that I'm now on here with Erica learning about evolution. At some point in the past, I don't remember when exactly, it came out that I am a young earth creationist. And I was not expecting the severe backlash I received, especially from people who were so excited and supportive of what I had created with TFE. Now, a couple people worth mentioning who immediately turned on me were YouTubers Planet Peterson and PhD Tony. Now, those two recently debated the topic of evolution on the Modern Day Debate YouTube channel against Donnie and Matt from the Standing for Truth YouTube channel. Erica, I know you have a history with Donnie. And I love the Modern Day Debate channel as debates pop up in my feed on all sorts of topics. And when one of them interests me, I watch it. Now, knowing I was going to be doing this with Erica, I watched the evolution debate between Donnie and Matt versus Planet Peterson and PhD Tony. Now, Planet Peterson, I saw you talking smack in the comments before we went live tonight, and I'm not going to throw you under the bus here, but I did email you after that debate, and I'm still waiting for a response. I'll leave it up to you if you want to show your audience my email. I'd love it if you would, but I at least would love a response. Anyway, people turned on me very quickly when they found out I was a young earth creationist, and they started saying that I was no different than a flat earther. They started saying I was a science denier and essentially wrote me off. Now, I want to give some advice here that I personally think is incredibly valuable. And the only reason I even have this advice to give is because of TFE. Number one, if you want to convince someone they are wrong and you want to change their mind, making fun of them is never going to accomplish that. When I got into the flat earth world, I quickly noticed that it was common to just make fun of them and belittle them and call them stupid. Now, people can do whatever they want. If you want to just make fun of people and call them stupid, go for it. But realize you are doing that for you. You are making fun of them because it makes you feel good. It's obviously never going to change anyone's mind. No one has ever been like, thanks so much for calling me dumb. I now realize you are right and I'm wrong. So back to point number one here. If you actually have a desire to show someone they are wrong and get them to change their mind, making fun of them is not the way to go. What I did with TFE is I told the flat earth community, hey, you are convinced that you're right. I think you're wrong. So let's just do something together to test our claims and see which side is actually right. This was extremely effective. I didn't belittle them or name call. Rather, I said I was open to being wrong. I asked them to reciprocate and also be open to being wrong. And we did something together, and both sides agreed to accept the results, meaning if we lived on a globe, there would be a 24-hour sun that never set in Antarctica in December. And if the Earth was flat, the sun would rise and set for us while we were in Antarctica. Now, making predictions based on a hypothesis is a very important part of science, and that's essentially what we did. Each side made predictions based on their model, and we tested it to see who was right. And of course, the globe side was right because we live on a globe. Now, TFE led to the largest exodus from flat Earth ever. And that continues to this day. But more importantly, anyone new that is hearing about flat Earth for the first time will soon enough hear about TFE and not even become a flat earther in the first place. I was actually recently contacted by a high schooler, and she let me know that the final experiment was actually being taught in their school now as part of the curriculum. I ended up doing a Zoom with her and some of her classmates and their teacher, and was really encouraged that what we did is now going to be used to educate others. And that is exactly how science should work. Now, that brings us back to you and me, Erica, and how we got connected. Fortunately, not everyone turned on me when they found out I was a young Earth creationist. A few people reached out to me privately and asked if they could have a conversation with me about evolution. A couple people even asked if I would be open to being taught evolution by them. Super cool. Now, this is how you reach someone if you want to change their mind. You and I, Erica, have a mutual friend. He's a YouTuber who goes by the name of Ruhif. And he was one of those who reached out to me about discussing evolution privately. And I gave him the same answer I gave everyone else. As soon as TFE is over, I promise to look more into evolution. And I wasn't just saying this to get them to stop bugging me. I meant it. And I had my light bulb moment when I was taking down flat Earth. I noticed that flat earthers take such a strong stance against the globe, but they know very little about the globe. As a general rule, flat earthers know very little about the globe and the globe model, yet they argue against it as if there's no possibility that they're wrong. With TFE, I essentially asked them to at least learn the globe model first before taking such a confident stance against it. Being curious and asking questions, even being skeptical, is fine, but the confidence exuded, which often bordered on arrogance, was not coming from a place of knowledge and careful study. And so my ask of them was to actually take a deep dive first and then make up your mind. Even if you remain a flat earther, at least you put in the work first. And so this was my own humility moment. I had to eat some humble pie and acknowledge to myself that I'm doing the exact same thing with evolution. For almost my entire life, I've been ardently anti-evolution, but do I really understand it? I don't. Have I actually taken the time to learn it? I haven't. And most importantly, what little I do know about evolution has come from creationists and not evolutionists themselves. The least I can do is listen to actual evolutionists and hear what they have to say. That way, I'm hearing this from the horse's mouth and confirming that what I hear from creationists is not a straw man or a misrepresentation. So our mutual friend Ruhif connected us, and I'm very glad he did. You have a great reputation, Erica, as not only an evolutionist, but someone who can teach evolution. And trust me, there's a reason I'm speaking to you and not some others who I won't name that prefer to engage in name calling and poking fun at. So I'm here to learn. I'm coming into this with an open mind. I'm doing exactly what I asked the flat earthers to do. And I'm here acknowledging that I might be wrong about this. And I'm not willing to be so dogmatic against evolution without first learning it. And I'm excited to learn from one of the best. Now, before we dive in, I need to make one more connection with flat Earth that I hope will really help the audience understand two things. First, why flat Earth and young Earth creation should never be equated. This is common. The entire flat Earth versus globe debate really comes down to the shape of an object in the present. That's it. It's about a shape of an object in the present. Now, that is something we can prove. There are no issues with proving the shape of an object that all of us live on and have access to. Now, evolution is quite different. Evolution is attempting to recreate what happened in the past, the distant past, I should add, and that introduces a complexity that is going to be very difficult to prove. I would argue it cannot be proven. And the field of science does a good job in acknowledging that science doesn't prove things like, say, mathematics does. Now, when it comes to understanding and determining what happened in the past, it becomes very difficult, even if it was just yesterday. Consider a crime that was committed, and a court is trying to show that a certain person did it. If you have eyewitnesses to the crime, that's incredibly helpful. But that's not always the case. It's rarely the case. And so they look to evidence to convince a jury that a certain someone did something specific at a certain time in the past. Without eyewitnesses, maybe you have footprints. A footprint might match the exact size of the suspect's feet, but there's always the possibility that the actual perpetrator had the same size feet. Maybe a vehicle was seen at the scene of the crime, and the make and model of the vehicle matched that of the person on trial. Again, there still remains the possibility that the actual perpetrator has the same vehicle. So I only say this to tell everyone that if you equate creationism to flat Earth, you will lose our attention immediately. They are not the same in any way. And I can go on. Flat Earthers have no commercial pilots, no PhDs, no scientists, and no experts. They really have nothing. But there are PhDs in every field of science who are young Earth creationists. And before you accuse me of appealing to authority, I'm not arguing that creationism is true because a bunch of people with PhDs are YEC. I'm merely pointing out that the comparison of flat Earth to young Earth creationism is not valid in any way whatsoever. Now, lastly, and this one is super important, something I learned in my time dealing with the flat Earth community is that they have been lied to. And the fact that they have been lied to is a significant reason they are flat Earthers. I will give two examples here. There was a PBS documentary against flat Earth. I actually haven't seen it, but this documentary did an experiment to prove we live on a globe, and they faked it. They completely faked it and lied about it and published it. And it was the flat Earthers who caught it and exposed them. Another really good example is one of the most famous time lapses of the 24-hour sun in Antarctica was edited. It was looped and did not show the same sun and clouds for the entire 24 hours. And again, the flat Earthers are the ones who figured this out. When you are lied to, and when you think you are watching something unedited and you discover that it's actually edited, you are going to assume that this is being done to hide the truth. That's the natural assumption that anyone would make. Now, none of this means that the globe is a lie and that we actually live on a flat Earth. What it does mean is that the threshold required to convert a flat earther to the globe is now higher. Because of these types of things, it makes it harder to actually convince a flat earther they are wrong. Consider, I had to actually take flat earthers to Antarctica to see the 24-hour sun with their own eyes. So I found empathy for them in realizing these things happened to them and understanding personally the conclusions you would come to if that happened to you as well. So all of you out there who really think us young Earth creationists have lost our minds, I want you to consider something, which is that fraud has happened in the world of evolution as well. And not just fraud, but racism and ties to slavery and the Holocaust as well. Darwin himself was a racist. This is often rebutted by the fact that he was against slavery, but that's not a valid argument. You don't have to be pro-slavery to be racist. Many abolitionists were racist. Darwin was definitely racist. He referred to blacks and Australian Aborigines as Negroes and savage races and said they would one day be extinct and replaced by the civilized races. A pygmy was once put in a zoo. They shaved his teeth to make him look like an animal and displayed him as a transition between chimps and humans. He was even put into a cage with an orangutan. Now, these stories really hurt my heart. He eventually killed himself, as you can imagine. And there has been rampant fraud in the world of fossils and evolution. I have entire books and documentaries covering the fraud. There has been so much. I'm sure everyone knows about Piltdown Man, which is one of the greatest frauds in the history of science. And Nebraska Man is another good example of either fraud or a grave error. Again, I don't believe any of this means evolution is false. People do bad things. But please consider that when a creationist like myself evaluates evolution, we are going to look at these frauds as lies to hide the truth. And what that means is the threshold to convince us we are wrong is going to be a lot higher. So I hope everyone can understand that. And if not empathize with us, at least sympathize with us. So Erica, really excited to do this with you.
I'm also just absolutely ecstatic. Obviously, I have a lot of thoughts about a lot of what you just said. I agree with a lot of it, and I disagree with a lot of it too. And I hope that I will be able to, at the very least, dissuade you on some of the things that I'm able to show like are factually incorrect. But I think that your overall sentiment is something that we can certainly agree on. The fact that you're beginning with where you're coming from and what your background is with all of this, having been exposed to mostly creationist sources and things like that, is incredibly honest, and I can't appreciate that enough. I certainly hope, and I was just getting on chat's case for this, I hope that viewers will appreciate that as well. You're coming at this from a perspective of you have a knowledge body that you're pulling from. Some of it's correct, some of it's incorrect. That's the case with everybody, right? But you're coming specifically from young earth creationism, so my perspective is going to be a lot more is incorrect there from a scientific perspective than is incorrect. And so I'm here to, as I said, hopefully elucidate from the perspective of conventional science why evolution stands as this foundational sort of cornerstone of biology. Why do scientists have so much faith in it? When, as you said, there are misdeeds in science. There is rampant racism in the history of science of all stripes. I will add, there's rampant racism in the history of humans in general, unfortunately, as horrible as it is. I don't think we can throw stones in glass houses with regard to that. But I actually think that the way that you've set this up is perfect for where we're going to get started today, because we're going to talk about the history of science. I was telling Will about this before we even got engaged with this project, but like I'm working on a pretty big video right now that's explicitly on the history of science, right? Why we know the things that we know, and where creationism fits in all of that, because creationism has gone part and parcel with the age of the earth and with evolutionary theory since its inception, at least here in the West. So you can't really talk about one without talking about the other, at least in my opinion. And so it's kind of perfect timing to dive into this first lesson by talking about the history of science. And like, if you're anything like me and you're a viewer out there, you're probably thinking like, who actually cares about like what crusty old guy said what? I had that exact line in my video, and that's fair enough. But I've sort of come around to this idea that by understanding the people who were behind these ideas and the context in which they lived, we can gain a greater appreciation for the concepts themselves, and why they were convinced, and why, in fact, we should be convinced as well. So we're going to talk a little bit later in the course about things like the influence of racism, about things like fossil frauds, about those kinds of concepts. Today is like super boilerplate stuff. Will gets the PowerPoints ahead of time, so he knows what we're about to talk about. For those of you in the audience, we're very simply going to work through the history of thought on evolutionary theory in the ancient age of the earth. And I will add that I'm at least a little bit familiar, although probably not as familiar as you are, Will, with where the theological trends were going as these things were happening. So I have a little bit here and there as to like, okay, how, because I'm sure you're aware with the flat earth stuff, like how did the church respond to Copernicus and Galileo, right? The Catholic Church was basically the government at the time, and the answer was not well, right? That changes as history moves forward, but I don't know. I think that probably the best thing to do is to just get started. How does that sound?
Let's dive in.
All right, cool. Will is free to ask questions wherever and whenever, so chat, do not get upset. I don't want to see any, why is he interrupting Erica? I want him to do that. This is meant to be educational, so I want him to feel comfortable doing that. I'm also, before we get started, I'm going to let this dog out because he's scratching at the door, and then we'll get moving. Fred, come on. Get out of here. Be gone. Also, for those of you who are super duper interested, I'll be providing a list of sources here at the end for like where I'm getting all of this information. But as I said, this is more or less my slideshow that I used to present to my students. As I said at the beginning, I taught biological anthropology as a lab instructor for 3 years, and then I taught the honors course for biological anthropology, just like the full course itself, for 1 year. Let's see here. Cancel, highlight this, minimize it so StreamYards can hopefully see it. Share screen, come on. There it is. Excellent. Okay, Will, let's get started. I'm so excited for this. Can you see that? Are we good?
Yes, looks great.
It's full screen, good to go?
Yep.
All right. So this is our first sort of lesson, history of thought. If you guys are concerned or curious as to like where we're going to go with this, which topics are we going to cover? If you're out there and you're like, why isn't she talking about radiometric dating in this? Or, why isn't she talking about endogenous retroviruses or the hominin fossil record? Very little of that, if any, is going to be in today's presentation, but we are going to get to it eventually. So you can check the description of this video if you want to find out when we're covering what. But I've been, as I said, won over by this idea that starting with the history of thought is actually the best way to do it. And I feel that this is how my students feel as well. That's been my experience, let's say. So what you can see on your screen now is one of my favorite pictures in biological anthropology. This is from a cave called Layang Pedikir in Indonesia. And a bunch of humans from, I believe this is 50-ish thousand years ago, if memory serves, have taken their hands and blown ochre over their hands to leave their mark in a cave. Why did they do that? I think that's a wonderful question to ask. And I think the reason is very simple. They did it because they wanted to say, I was here. That's a very human thing to do, just as it is a very human thing to do to ask questions like, why am I here? What am I on? How long has this been here? And where did we come from? A little bit about me getting started for those of you who might not know. Here are a bunch of pictures of me doing goofy stuff. I got my BSA in pre-professional animal science from the University of Arkansas, my master's of research in primate biology, behavior, and conservation from the University of Roehampton in London, and I'm a current PhD candidate for biological anthropology at the University of Redacted. I'm also a science communicator. So I'm a pretty good person, I like to think, for teaching somebody who is not into evolutionary theory what it is and why science accepts it as robustly as it does. And perhaps from Will's perspective, why it is that he's getting this response from people who do accept evolutionary theory. Why do they conflate young Earth creationism to something like flat Earth? Why is that such a knee-jerk reaction from those of us in the scientific community? And I'm going to argue that it's because the preponderance of evidence for evolutionary theory and for the ancient age of the Earth is as powerful as the evidence that the Earth is a globe. It's a different type of evidence, but different types of evidence aren't necessarily weighted in science, right? We'll talk about that here in a moment. So the goals of this course, for anybody who might not be aware, is to teach Will Duffy or anybody who's watching what evolution is and why the scientific community is convinced by it. And I'll add how it specifically applies to humans, because this is a hybrid course that I used to teach at my university. I sort of taken the primatology part out of the middle and inserted in more relevant evolutionary theory stuff, much to my chagrin, but not everybody wants to sit around and listen to how circumposition is different from a colobin. Least of all Will, I'm sure. But if you get curious, Will, stop me and we'll talk all about it. I want to be very clear, this is not a creationism debunking series. This does not mean we will not talk about creationism. Will is a young Earth creationist, so I'm sure, particularly when we get to topics in like biological anthropology, or when we talk about radiometric dating, or when we talk about soft tissue and dinosaur fossils potentially later on, I'm sure Will is going to have things to add, questions and perspectives from the knowledge bases that he pulls from. And I welcome that. I want Will to feel comfortable bringing any and all creationist arguments to me, but I'm not going to bring them to him. I'm presenting what conventional science believes and why it believes it. Conventional science, for better or worse, from Will's perspective, I suppose, isn't really concerned with what young Earth creationists are saying. And part of that is because as a science, young Earth creationism isn't offering very much in the way of like testable predictions and things, but that's sort of a story for here in a little bit. So if you have any questions about creationism and you as the audience wants to pitch those to me or Will, this probably isn't the series for that, but I digress. The roadmap for this course is pretty simple. Unit 1 is going to concern the basics of evolutionary theory. Unit 2 is going to concern a deeper look into several fields within and adjacent to evolutionary biology. That was the former primatology section. And Unit 3 is going to be human evolution. So I know you guys all know that I'm saving the best for last. I'm saving the things that I like the most for the end of this little foray. But unfortunately, this is the way I think it needs to be pitched. And this is the way that I teach it to my students. Today, we're covering history of evolutionary thought. So we have to start with a pretty simple question. Will covered some of this in his intro, but this is how I start it with my students because I get a lot of, I teach a 101 course. So I get business students and I get communication students. Most of the people who are coming through are taking my course to get their natural science credit. So we have to start with the question, what is science? What actually is it? Science is a way of knowing. It's a means by which we acquire knowledge about the world around us. And it has to have, I'm going to present you a very Popperian perspective here of what science needs to be sort of, or what something needs to be to be considered science. But I hope that that's justified. I think it's justifiable, and I hope it is to you as well. Science, for one, seeks natural causal explanations for observable phenomena, right? We want to understand why things happen. Why does lightning tend to strike higher areas as opposed to lower areas? Why do we sweat when it gets hot outside? It can't speak to supernatural or unobservable processes or unique events, right? Science is natural causal explanations for observable phenomena. That means if it's ghosts, if it's miracles, if it's things that are by their very nature unnatural, science can't investigate it. That doesn't mean those questions are not worth asking, right? It just means science isn't going to be the tool we use to actually investigate it. Science also seeks observable regularity, right? We have to be able to test our expectations, our experiments multiple times over to see if they're consistent, if this is to actually make predictions about the future and be useful to us, whether it's useful like in industry or useful just in enriching our lives. So it can't be like a one-time thing. Science also relies on empirical observation by independent observers. You can't just have one person who says they did an experiment in their backyard and thus they are correct. You have to have a bunch of people doing the same types of tests all over the world, like through time. The more studies that come to the same conclusion, the better. And those ideas, the proposed explanations for phenomena that we observe, must be falsifiable. They have to be able to be proven false. If it can't be proven false, at least from a Popperian sense, it's not science. The best part of science is also the part that I see people complain about most often in every area of pseudoscience that I engage. And that's that they don't like that science changes all the time. But I would argue, as I have many times on this channel, that the fact that science is provisional and that the claims are open to rejection, like depending or pending future data coming to light, is its greatest strength. It means it's adaptable. It means that it's evergreen, right, in its utility to us as humans.
Quick question for you. Are you going to be covering either today or later on a future session ways that evolution can be falsified?
Yes.
Okay, great.
We can talk about that today. I can offer a few things right off the bat, or we can wait till we get to Darwin.
I'm totally fine waiting.
Yeah, I'll throw a couple of things in when we talk about Darwin's idea, specifically it being pushed backwards into time. But if we don't get to that today, because like I said, there's a lot to get to, we can certainly talk about it next session. How about that?
Awesome. Great.
Just remind me.
Okay.
So science, as I said, is a way of knowing. This is a little graphic that I found that's like a little Venn diagram of questions that science can address, questions that science cannot address, and where they sort of overlap with one another. So you can pause that and take a look at it if you want. I think it's quite sweet. Because I say this to my students every time, like science isn't meant to answer a lot of these more philosophical questions. That doesn't mean those questions shouldn't be asked. So how does science function? Science functions the same way now as it always has. The science that allowed Galileo to sort of put forward this heliocentric model of the universe is the same method that the first ape used to clack two rocks together. What will happen if I do this? A question or an observation, followed by research, investigating the world a little bit deeper, a hypothesis. This is what I think will happen if I do these two things, an experiment to see whether you're correct or not, analysis of those results, and then reporting those conclusions. The scientific method is the cornerstone of all of human discovery. A simple example for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. So I grew tomatoes this year. This is not an actual picture of my tomatoes because my tomatoes this year were mostly decimated by snails, which sucks, but it is what it is. Let's say that I observed my tomato plants didn't grow as well this year as they did last year. That's my observation. I might ask the question, okay, like why is that? It could be the case that this year I used a different fertilizer than I did last year, which leads to the fair inference that on the basis of this observation, maybe the fertilizer that I used last year, fertilizer A, is just a better fertilizer than the one that I used this year. And that's why my tomato yield wasn't as good. So the statement fertilizer A produces better results than fertilizer B, that's a plain old hypothesis, right? Classic. Hypothesis, or a hypothesis, or rather hypotheses, are provisional explanations of a phenomenon, right? Provisional is the key word there. It's like hypothesis in science is what people think a theory is when they use it in common parlance. This is just an idea as to why something is. It has to be tested to support or to deny it It's just an idea that you're putting forward without that. Now, you make hypotheses, about a lot of different things, but not all of them are interesting, even if they are falsifiable. That's my dog Teddy in my office. She's not in here now because she'd be clacking around with her long nails. You could theoretically hypothesize that my dog is purple, right? But you would be wrong because she's not. You can look at her right there. But also, that hypothesis is uninteresting because it doesn't explain anything, right? A hypothesis is meant to sort of move the ball down the court. It shouldn't just stand in isolation as some kind of sort of bonkers statement. Hypotheses can also potentially be invalid for reasons that most of you in the audience are already thinking, right? If a hypothesis is not falsifiable, it's not valid in the sense that science can't test it. So we can do this with any question that we ask in science. We can say, okay, well, we had our hypothesis. What would prove it wrong? What would prove the hypothesis that fertilizer A is better than fertilizer B incorrect, right? Well, we could test our fertilizers and see what those results are. The hypothesis could be falsified if we use a bunch of different tomato plants or use a bunch of fertilizers on a bunch of different tomato plants, and then we find out that either both tomato plants grew equally well under both fertilizers, that maybe B actually performed better than A, or we could potentially provide support for our hypothesis if we find out that, yeah, A's tomato plant actually did grow better than B's tomato plant. Right? This is all like boilerplate stuff, but it's worth talking about because, again, this is the backbone of every question that we as humans can ask. So if our hypothesis is shown to be false, right, we reject it. We kick it to the curb. Alternatively, we can support it. But just because you support a hypothesis doesn't mean that you are correct. It just means that that hypothesis is supported by your particular experiment. In order to actually show that your hypothesis has legs, you kind of have to show that it's correct over and over and over and over again, and other people need to do that too. Now, critical note here, and this is something that Will mentioned very briefly when he was talking about flat Earth and sort of mathematics versus science. You can't prove a hypothesis. And in fact, you can't prove anything in science. You can provide support for a hypothesis, or you can reject a hypothesis, but you're never going to prove something in science categorically. Because again, that would kind of defeat the point. That would kind of kill science's greatest strength, which is that it is, in fact, provisional. Now, hypotheses require multiple independent observers to provide real solid support for them through space and time. If it continues to be supported and not rejected, we can really up our confidence in it. And maybe, just maybe, it's going to be well supported enough that it's going to become potentially a theory, or if it's stating sort of what is happening, a law. Now, something that's often misunderstood within science in general, and by lay people, I should say, is that hypotheses graduate to becoming theories, and then theories graduate to becoming laws. That's not the case. Theories never graduate to become laws because theories are explaining why something is happening, whereas a law is explaining what is happening. This is why laws tend to be depicted mathematically, whereas theories are much more qualitative and involved and mouthy and lengthy. A couple of examples of theories would be germ theory, theory of general relativity, and the theory of evolution. And then we have laws like the law of conservation of energy or the universal law of gravitation.
Let me jump in here real quick. Can you go back?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to take a moment to, if there's any creationists listening, a couple arguments that I think our side uses, which are really bad, and we should just immediately stop using them, is one of them. A lot of people like to say, were you there? That's not valid. We're all trying to understand the past. It's very valuable to understand the past. And then one that I really don't like is when they say that evolution is just a theory.
Yeah.
That tells me they don't understand science. It's very important. So we should just stop using those arguments. So if you're listening, please consider that.
Will, that's exactly why this section is at the very beginning of the course, right? Is because that's not a creationist thing. Unfortunately, that's a people thing. And the reason is because colloquially, theory is hypothesis. Like when someone's like, oh, well, I have a theory as to, who drank the last beer. They don't have a theory about that. They have a hypothesis. And it's that their spouse did it because, they found their spouse's acrylic nail on the beer casing, right? So it's not just the fault of creationists here. This is just common parlance is unfortunately moving against us. And that's why when we teach students, we're like, hey, we got to establish what actually is a theory scientifically. What does a theory mean and how does it differ from a hypothesis? So I am very irritating in my personal life because I don't theorize about anything. I hypothesize about which of my 3 dogs pulled the cornbread off the table. Now, historical versus observational science. This is a funny one to me, because before I taught, I would very regularly say, these are not real terms in science. These are terms that you typically find creationists using, and I sort of found this as a means by which to denigrate what is perceived as historical science as somehow less than. That's not necessarily the case. This was a slide that I actually inherited, the difference between historical and observational science, but they are in quotation marks. And the reason that they're in quotation marks is because functionally these two things are not different, right? They're used as terms because they're useful to convey what we're talking about, but functionally these two things work exactly the same. I'm going to get more into that in a second. If we can't directly observe past events, it seems like that might be an issue, right? What if we can't observe them? How do we actually run experiments on those? Well, science in general does not rely on direct observation. Instead, we can explain these past events by using well-established theories and laws that we have supported in the present, or by applying predictions and experiments to the past, right? So let's say, the classic example from evolutionary theory is the discovery of the transitional fossil Tiktaalik, which is sort of this organism that bridges the gap, morphologically speaking, between lobe-finned fish and land-dwelling tetrapods. And Neil Shubin and his team used evolutionary assumptions to make a prediction as to where that specimen should be if evolutionary theory is legitimate. Then they went out and searched for that fossil using those assumptions and predictions, and then lo and behold, they found the fossil. You can do the same thing in like oil exploration or in cosmology, as we'll see here in a moment. By understanding how theories and laws work, we can explain lots of different past events. I don't think that's very controversial. And theories and laws also allow us to not just look into the past and explain them and sort of make the past explicable, but it also allows us to predict these future events as long as they're regular and the conditions where they work are understood. So, I can do an experiment where I plant an apple, and I plant it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And all 6 times that I plant that apple, an apple tree grows, right? What's going to happen if I plant it a 7th time? Probably an apple tree is going to grow. That's that classic repetition that's going to provide support for an idea. Now, a couple of examples of the use of quote-unquote historical science come from fields like geology. Modern earthquakes leave certain stress fractures, in the rocks. So we can identify those stress fractures at places like, the San Andreas Fault or whatever. And then when we find those same stress fractures in the fossil record, we can say, well, that was probably an earthquake, right? Cosmology, same way. We observe the formation of craters from asteroid impacts today. So when we find ancient craters on other planets, we can probably intuit that those were formed because they were hit by an asteroid. We didn't observe every impact that happened on the moon, but we observe impacts all the time here on Earth and on other stellar bodies. And we know what the results of that look like. We know that those are craters caused by asteroid impacts. Biology is the same way. Certain types of plants can only live under certain environmental conditions today. You can't grow a palm tree outside in, Antarctica. That's just not going to work. So when we find these types of plants that prefer warmer conditions, and in fact, they need those warm conditions to grow, we can pretty well intuit that the conditions of the past where that plant lived were at the very least similar.
Let me say something real quick. Sorry, can you go back?
Yeah, of course.
This slide reminded me of something that I learned a very long time ago. I don't even know if it's true. I don't even know what it means. So you don't even have to respond to it, but I just want to mention it because it's fascinating to me. I'll mention things throughout our time together over the next year that just have stuck with me over the years. This easily could have been told to me 15 or 20 years ago. But I was told by a creationist that they actually found tropical flora in the mouth of a frozen mammoth.
Tropical flora in the mouth of a frozen mammoth in Siberia?
Yes. That I don't know where. It stuck with me because I couldn't wrap my mind around it. And so, again, I haven't verified it, but if that's true, it's very interesting.
That's super interesting. I mean, I've not heard that. I've heard a lot of creationist claims about mammoths, but that's not one of them. I'd have to look into it to see. I can tell you that we have a lot of frozen mammoths whose bellies are full of like Arctic plants, right? And we have a lot of other sort of frozen organisms whose bellies are full of sort of location appropriate Siberian permafrost style plant matter. So to me, my question would be, if, like, let's just take it at face value, if there's a mammoth that has tropical remains in its belly, what do we do with all of the examples where they don't? What actually was the climate like? You know what I mean? If
Right.
one has tropical and and all of the rest have regular Arctic plants, what do we do with that? I don't know though. I'll have to look up the example.
If I can find it, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please do. So a couple of critical components of this idea of like not being present, as you were talking about in your intro, is that these principles work to our advantage in the recent past as well, right? The idea that we can make inferences about events that we didn't directly witness with our eyes, that's the backbone of a lot of different fields. And in fact, I would argue that there is a component of that in virtually every field of science. Forensics, classic example, you already mentioned it, but it's like a blunt force weapon is going to leave an identifiable wound. So if we find a dead body with that same kind of wound, we can infer that they were probably killed by a blunt force weapon. The skull that's on your screen right now, that individual was killed with a hammer, which that makes sense. That little hole certainly looks like a hammer-shaped hole. And pathology as well, right? Like people tend to spread respiratory illnesses more easily in public places because you're coughing, the droplets are getting everywhere. So if someone falls ill with a cold after attending a party, we can infer that somebody at the party was probably sick first, and God only knows how many people they infected. This has happened to me a million times. So science is an iterative process, as we talked about earlier. Like we talked about the differences between these sort of different quote unquote types of science. But because science is provisional and always open to rejection or reinterpretation, we have to keep that in mind as we sort of fold it into our society, interact with it, and use it as a tool. So you can see on your screen there the scientific method. Pretty simple stuff. Everybody's familiar with it. Now, peer review is the means by which we kind of test the rigor of given ideas. This is the process by which scientific research is scrutinized and validated by experts prior to publication in a journal or a book. I have an exasperated gibbon there because the nature of peer review is that if you're trying to publish in a top journal like Nature or Cell, they're publishing maybe 5 to 12% of all submitted papers. And a lot of those that are submitted are rejected outright. And also a lot of them go through revisions and then still end up rejected, which is very frustrating. Most journals that aren't these top tier ones, though, are still going to only publish about 25% of submissions. And I've experienced this myself in grant writing, because grant writing also involves peer review. And what basically ends up happening is, here I am, a PhD student or PhD candidate rather, and I'm doing a project on sexual dimorphism in Miocene ape canine teeth. And then they're going to send my project proposal to like the 3 other people on the planet who study that. And because they've been doing that for 30 plus years, they're going to identify all of these little minute details that I didn't consider. And so when they send my grant back to me and they're like, we will or won't fund this, they're going to send it back with feedback that's like, you need to take this into account. A classic example is that I think I've mentioned on this channel before is when I submitted my NSF grant. I think it was my NSF. It might have been my wiki. One of the grants that I submitted last year. One of the feedback comments that I got was that I hadn't run a power analysis, which is the type of statistical analysis that you use to determine how many specimens in your sample you need to get a statistically reasonable result, like whether your sample size is high enough. That's something that needed to be included that I didn't think to include because I thought what I'd proposed was reasonable. It was based off of another paper, but it turns out I needed to dot my I's and cross my T's myself. So that's the sort of wonder and agony of peer review.
So with peer review, there's an interesting situation here, and I don't know any examples, but I can tell you creationists have this idea that it's possible, and again, this could be false, it could be a conspiracy theory, but that it's possible that peer review journals won't publish their stuff. Now, fortunately, I do know some young Earth creationists have been published, but I've noticed something else, which I think might be a bigger problem. And again, I don't know how to solve it. It just happened yesterday on something I was watching. Is the evolutionist who's debating the creationist will say, so if a creationist does bring something up that was published in a peer review journal, they'll say, well, that journal's not respected. That's not a top journal. And so it kind of seems like this impossible situation. And I don't know if you have any quick knee-jerk thoughts on that.
I do. I think that's a great question. I mean, my knee-jerk response to that is that when we go back to this slide, that these top journals are publishing 5 to 12% of all submitted papers. The reason for that is because whatever's being submitted is being given to the world experts on that subject, right? I mean, I'm talking about if you submit a paper that's on genetics, someone who might have actually pioneered the technique that you used might be peer reviewing it. So if you're submitting an idea as grandiose, I would propose as young earth creationism, from my side of things, I would want to see that in a journal that has some of the highest standards because it's overturning such a solid paradigm, I guess. Now, my experience in reading creationist papers, and I've read a lot of them, is that they tend to show up in either creationist journals where they're being peer reviewed by other creationists. That's not bad on its face. But the problem with that is, and you can ask Glenn about this, because our mutual friend, Ruhif, about this, because he had this experience himself when he was trying to submit to the Answers Research Journal as a non-creationist. The problem is these journals, these young earth creationist journals, or the ones that they are capable of getting submissions into, they're not well staffed enough to actually have robust peer review. So in Glenn's case, a geologist was peer reviewing his genetics work, which that's just not good science, right? Like I'm not going to be able to peer review a chemistry journal. That doesn't mean I'm a bad scientist. That doesn't mean that the geologist who did it is a bad geologist. It just means that they shouldn't be peer reviewing that in particular. So my challenge to creationists would be, if this is an idea that is so evident and robust and the data are so solid, I think it should be able to withstand the harshest style of peer review from the experts in that field. And I'll also add that the only other top place that I tend to see creationists published are in journals like Biocomplexity. So they're intelligent design journals, they're not intelligent design journals necessarily, but they're very friendly towards it. Let's put it that way. Is that a lot of their work tends to be very theoretical. So it tends to be like, well, this could be an explanation. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But then the next step is to show that it is, right? Or to at least preclude all of these other explanations. And I in my experience reading their stuff, I haven't tended to see that. So that's my sort of off the cuff response to that.
Okay, cool. The good news is that there are young earth creationists that have been published in reputable journals, and we can cover that if we get to it.
I would love that. In fact, what would be fun is to bring a couple of the ones that you like and we can take a look at them. Because I've read a lot of them. And we can cross that bridge when we come to it. I include this bit to like engage my students to say like, look, there's science happening in real time all around us and it's fun to keep track of. So like we know the most recent one that's really cool is like, there might have been life on Mars, which is neat. I don't know the details of it. The one that I always pitch my students is this one on did Homo naledi bury its dead? Because the way that this went down is here was the first paper, evidence for deliberate burial of the dead by Homo naledi by Berger and colleagues. And then boom, we get Martin Torres, who says no scientific evidence that Homo naledi buried their dead and produced rock art. And then boom, no sedimentological evidence for deliberate burial by Homo naledi. This is science working as it should, right? Someone presents an idea that's pretty outlandish. And the reason I say it's outlandish is because this hominin that's being proposed to have buried its dead has a brain case size that's like not that much larger than a chimpanzee. These guys are very similar to like Lucy's species, Australopithecus. So the idea that it's burying its dead, that would be pretty groundbreaking. So Lee publishes his idea that it's like, wow, this is pretty incredible. And then just gets absolutely like kneecapped by everybody else in the scientific community who are like, no, that actually doesn't stand. And if you read some of these papers, as I did on this channel in excruciating detail, we're talking about the minutia of like geochemical analyses of the burial site and places adjacent to it, where some of these critiques are like, but did you consider this particular chemical? Like it's the minutia of the minutia. And then Lee hit back with actually, he made it a more expanded paper and then was like, but they still did bury their dead. And his newest paper is over 100 pages long and it has the same title. So I've read it. I've given my opinion on it on this channel. I'm not convinced that Homo naledi buried its dead, but I always show this to my student as a way of being like, science is rife with fights, right? Fights are like, people tend to think of science and scientists as these stuffy, like kind of codgers who like don't want to be challenged. That's the opposite of how, in my experience, science functions. As somebody who goes to these conferences and watches a bunch of old people fight about an argument that they had in 1982, it's a real treat to see. So, what do we want to know about the history of evolutionary thought? Now that we understand like what science is and how it functions, how does this apply to evolution? The questions that we want to ask are like, how did the people in the past make sense of the variation that they observed in the world around them? How did those observations and their explanations eventually lead to our current understanding of things like the age of the earth and evolutionary theory? And does the previous reasoning about these ideas hold true to the modern day? Fair enough, I think. I think that those are all fair questions. So the biggest questions that evolutionary theory seeks to answer, right? Like, why does this theory exist in the first place? Is how do we explain the diversity of life on Earth today? There are so many different species that we share the Earth with, and so many of them do so many incredible things, and they behave in such fascinating ways, some of which are familiar to us, some of which are deeply, deeply foreign to us. How did they get to be the way that they are, or were they always that way? And how do we explain the diversity of life in the past as well? We can also ask, why are there groups of animals that look similar, right? Why do cats have a lot in common? Why is there a group of animals that look kind of doggish? Why is there a group of animals that looks kind of monkeyish and almost human-y in many ways? And why is there a group of animals that's just a bunch of hoofed things? And they're all different sizes, but by and large, they're doing very similar things. Why do these groups exist? And why are some groups more similar than other groups? And where, if at all, do humans fit into the grand scheme of life? Evolutionary theory is going to provide us the following answer. Populations of organisms, so that's groups of critters, form lineages that evolve in response to changes in their environment over time, and these lineages are going to potentially yield new species. If that's happening forward in time, if you rewind the clock, taken back in time, those populations and species will converge upon one another to a last universal common ancestor, including humans. That's how evolutionary theory answers the questions that we just asked. Famously, Theodosius Dobzhansky in 1973, Theodosius Dobzhansky was a famous theistic evolutionist and a part of the sort of hubbub around the modern synthesis, said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I think that that is a very fair and true statement, as I'll hopefully pitch to you. But that statement that I just said, what does that actually mean? And how did we get to that modern understanding? That's a long story. It's a story that starts between 400 and 300 BC, or BCE, if you would prefer. And it begins with the Greeks, right? Now, I say it begins with the Greeks. In actuality, it probably began way before the Greeks, like as if the Greeks are the first ones to sit around and say, wow, where did humans come from? Has life ever changed? Has this earth always been the way that it is? What shape is the earth, right? These are questions that they did ask, but people before them probably asked it too. The thing is about science and about progress in human society is that progress typically happens when people have the time and the resources to sit around and mull things over. And until the Greeks, and this happened in multiple different societies around the world, but we're concerned with the Western world right now, the Greeks were one of the first to actually start putting some of this to paper. Now, one of the first earliest attempts at ordering the world was by Plato. Plato pitched this idea called essentialism. He looked at the diversity of life on Earth, at all of these different organisms, from fungi to trees to foxes and cats and humans. And he said that essentially organisms, all living things, and even some inanimate things, have a set of unchanging characteristics that make them the way that they are, some kind of essence to them. And that variation amongst things is kind of just an unimportant deviation from that essence. So there's an ideal chair, there's an ideal cat, there's an ideal dog, there's an ideal horse. Variation that we see in the natural world, all of that variation that we just talked about moments ago, that's aberrant, right? That's deviations on the norm away from this idea. That's why they call it the Platonic ideal, away from this Platonic ideal. Plato's essentialism, obviously, does not propose that species change, that populations of organisms change, because that change would be aberrance, and it can only go so far before it's too aberrant to actually survive, would be something that Plato would propose. He had this emphasis in his writings on discontinuity and consistency, and how these two or constancy rather, and how these two things sort of clashed with one another. and where they melded together, I should say, as well. All species, from Plato's perspective, were created perfectly, and no change is really possible. Plato's student Aristotle said basically the same thing, but he would organize life onto the great chain of being, or the scala naturae. This idea that it's like, okay, at the lowest level, you have inanimate things, and then you have living but inanimate things like plants, and then you have animals, and then you have humans, and then you have angels, and then you have the gods. That was Aristotle's perspective. He also, obviously, just like essentialism, just like his mentor, didn't believe that these species could change. They existed on a great chain of being, but they were locked in place. Now, a global look gives us a much more diverse perspective. Zhuangzi, which I'm probably mispronouncing, in roughly 400 BCE, was a Taoist philosopher. And Taoism views humans and nature as being much more in a constant state of transformation than the sort of fixed ideas that we saw with the Greeks. So Zhao thought that perhaps species could develop features related to the environments that they lived in. If everything is changing, why not organisms, right? That's very intrinsic to that philosophy of Taoism, and I don't think it's a coincidence that philosophies inform how we view the natural world. If you believe that your spirit is in a constant state of change, or maybe if you believe in something like reincarnation, you're probably more likely to accept the idea that things in nature can change as well. Saint Augustine of Hippo, in about 300, 400 AD, was a Roman African Christian theologian and philosopher who, interestingly enough, argued that Genesis was a non-literal story and that species could change. But the reason that he thought Genesis was non-literal or that forms could change, I should say, not species. Species weren't a thing yet. But the reason that he thought Genesis was non-literal is because he was like, why wouldn't, God is the God of the universe. Like, why would he take 6 days to do something? The 6-day thing is only so humans can understand it. What God actually did is he snapped his fingers and created everything in an instant. And he actually has a text on this called The Literal Meaning of Genesis. That's a fascinating read. Meanwhile, during the Islamic Golden Age, we have a couple of individuals, Nasir al-Din Tusi and Ibn Khaldun, who argued that respectively variation was very important, that perhaps animals could adapt from to their environments, and that humans may have come from some variation amongst those other animals. Ibn Khaldun, fascinatingly specifically, I should say, argued that humans came from the world of the monkeys, which I always point this out to my students, but I think it's really interesting that a lot of the thinkers who were sort of friendly towards this idea that humans may be related to other primates were the ones who lived around other primates. Like, it's not surprising that the Greeks didn't see the human connection to monkeys because they didn't see monkeys ever, except when they were rarely imported to fight in the Colosseum or whatever. Whereas places like Southeast Asia and places like the Middle East are prone to having many more primates there and see how they act. It's just a trend that I've noticed. Around this time, too, we're having another conversation about geocentrism, right? Like, as at the cusp of the Enlightenment in the Dark Ages back in the West, people are trying to figure out, like, what is the order of things? The Earth was generally considered or appreciated, I should say, to be a globe by this point. But geocentrism, which was initially pitched alongside heliocentrism with the Greeks, sort of has this revival during the medieval period. This idea that the Earth is at the center of the universe and everything sort of rotates around it. And this is linked, of course, to the idea of design, that design is evident in the universe. So why wouldn't, if the Earth is sort of God's pinnacle of creation and humans are the pinnacle within the pinnacle here, why wouldn't everything rotate around it? This has additional implications in all the writings of this time, which are arguing that reality is very harmonious, it's very structured, and it is, in fact, relatively constant. That's going to be important. We're seeing this theme of constancy and fixity appear over and over and over again. William Paley is going to come at the very tail end of this concept of species fixity. And he's going to pitch the idea of teleology. Teleo means end, so it's the study of sort of the ends of things, the meaning of things, the intrinsic design of things. And he argues for the existence of an intelligent creator based off of the perceived evidence of deliberate design. And he pitches this, I believe his book was actually titled Natural Theology, but there were many natural theologies in existence at this time, different gentlemen naturalists who were also Christians who were many times men actually of the church. They were sort of moonlighting as scientists, would come out and pitch their own natural theologies. So Paley has this argument from design, and everybody's probably heard it. This is a sort of dumbed down version of it, but it's like anybody who would find a pocket watch in a field would recognize that it was designed intelligently. Living beings are similarly complex, and so living beings must also be designed. It's a very straightforward argument, right? This is coming directly out of, again, those perspectives right at the edge of the Enlightenment. Now, there are a couple of problems with teleology, and I stop my students here because we don't tend to get into theology or into teleology much beyond this point. So I sort of stop with them and I'm like, okay, like why doesn't that work? That sounds so intuitive. And in fact, it was so intuitive that Darwin was convinced of it before he ever went off on the voyage of the Beagle. He loved natural theology, and he saw William Paley as a genius. But the problem is many things appear to be designed which are demonstrably not designed. Like we observe complicated things emerge essentially from chaos. So how do we actually differentiate between the designed and the natural? The classic example that is a refute to teleology, if you will, are glasses, right? The nose is perfectly designed to hold up the glasses. But that's because glasses were designed to fit on top of your nose. The nose wasn't designed to hold up the glasses. Similarly, and this is the one that I propose a lot to when I talk to creationists, we find some of the most complicated systems in nature, which are the enormously interdependent ecosystems. And we don't see these things emerge like out of a divine intervention, right? Like primary succession occurs on volcanic islands, and we watch ecosystems emerge over time as first the moss and lichens show up, then small plants, animals. If it's an island ecosystem, it's usually birds and bats and things of that nature. Then like more complicated plants, trees eventually take root, and then you have an ecosystem where every single member of it is absolutely critical for that ecosystem to function. We've seen what can happen when you completely annihilate a keystone species. The ecosystem falls apart. And yet every piece of that ecosystem is necessary for the ecosystem to function, and that ecosystem can emerge from nothing effectively. I also point out things like geologic structures like arches or like the Giant's Causeway, which, you know, humans make arches, humans carve geometric shapes. These are things that seem like they could potentially be designed, but we know that nature is capable of making them. So the question, let me capstone this off. The question then is, how do we tell the difference?
Cool. Yeah, let me jump in here. We don't have to talk about this, by the way. We don't talk about it now. We don't talk about it ever. But when I look at that archway, I don't see design. So right now, I consider this teleological argument a good argument. Like, for example,
do you see design in an ecosystem?
In what way? I mean, everything I see on here, on the top, I see design.
So if it's designed, how come we can watch ecosystems emerge?
Well,
with no designer like clearly at play.
Sure. Without understanding exactly what an ecosystem is, I would say that whatever that life is was programmed by a designer. Is that fair to say?
I mean, I think that's fair to say, but I would argue that, sorry, I just tapped my mic. I would argue that, well, I would say that I've heard that argument before, right? This idea that it's like God may be tinkering with these organisms in real time, but that's non-falsifiable, right? Like the problem with teleology is exactly what you see on the screen. We can't differentiate between the designed and the natural. I don't imagine that we're going to, and I said this sort of at the top when you and I were speaking about like the contents of this PowerPoint, but like, I don't think that you would disagree that species can change over time, right? So how do we tell the difference between, you know, what nature is capable of doing and what is what requires a designer? It's not that teleology is impossible. It's that teleology is non-scientific because it can't actually be tested or parsed as set apart from science, right? Like when I have a buddy who studies ecosystems, and when they talk about something like primary succession, right? This is a new volcanic island shows up in Hawaii or in another archipelago, as happens every day. Islands are growing every day. These islands will first be populated by, you know, small plants and things like moss and lichen, as you can see on the screen there, but no one put them there. Those moss and lichen develop, and then organisms make it to that island. Maybe sometimes they're washed up there, sometimes they fly there. Some of them can eat the moss and lichen and the small little plants, and so they start to develop an interdependent relationship, producer and consumer, right? But then other animals will get there that can't eat that moss and lichen, and they die off. So the ecosystem ends up pruning individuals who can't survive there. And then more individuals show up and colonize, and you get more diversity on this island as more things wash up or fly in, or birds poop out seeds that they picked up on the mainland, until eventually you've got hundreds of species, not individuals, species, each of which is interdependent upon one another. And if you take any one out, like kill off the moss all of a sudden, everything that eats that moss is going to die, or it has to find something else to eat. And so what I'm saying is that this food web, this ecosystem, is incredibly complex, where every single individual is playing a role. It's not dissimilar to systems that humans create, right? So what I'm saying is that if we can watch those things emerge, then they don't necessarily need to be designed. So then how do we tell the difference between systems in biology that are incredibly complicated and thus appear like they need a designer, if we have all of these examples of incredibly complicated systems emerging without a designer, at least without one that's evident? I can't prove or disprove that there's a designer at play tinkering, but that's not a scientific question.
Yeah, there's something going on here which I can't quite put my finger on, which is fascinating to me. And again, we don't have to spend any extra time on it, but there's something to where all of us universally will see it and immediately know that it was intelligently designed, even if it's simple. So let me give you an example. It could be just a simple carving in a cave, right? A very rudimentary carving in a cave. We will see that. It could be like a stick figure. And we all immediately know that was intelligently designed. We have no idea who did it or when, but we just know. And so I'm struggling to look at things and determine when, like, why we're not all agreeing that it was designed in some instances and not others.
I think that's a tough one for me, though, because I see, and I'm not the only person who's like this. This is really common in people, right? It's called like pareidolia, right? Where you see patterns where there is none, right? Like I can look at a paint splatter and see images in it. I can look at wood grain and see stupid Sid the Sloth with the two big eyes and then the eye or the nose in the middle from Ice Age. Right? People post about this. I mean, there's an entire subreddit dedicated to it. No one drew those, but they look like images. So the reason why we propose when we see images in caves and we know that a human did that is because humans are still drawing in caves today. I think the real question is, why do we suppose that other incredibly complicated systems that we know are natural, like wood grain creating pictures or the geometric shapes of the Giant's Causeway, or indeed the intricacy of an ecosystem, why do those imply a designer if we can watch them form without one? And in fact, if that's the case, and this is the critical point, how can we say anything does? And that's the issue with teleology. Again, like if you want to use intuition there and say, you know, anybody can look at, like as Paley said, that's why Paley's argument was so strong, because it appeals so strongly to our intuition. But the problem is biology isn't intuitive, and science isn't intuitive either. As a guy who dealt with flat earthers, you know as well as I do, I've encountered flat earthers myself who are like, look at the horizon, it looks flat. And it's like, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's flat. So when you see something that appears to be designed, like the Giant's Causeway or like an ecosystem or like DNA, that doesn't mean that it is. And that's where teleology runs into the problem, is it can't come up with the scientific means to discriminate.
Okay, I'll look into that more. I appreciate it.
Let's, again, anytime you want to stop, I'm happy to do it. So the first person to come, oh gosh, I just yelled into my mic. The first person in the Middle Ages and sort of the edge of the Enlightenment, again, to use that phrase, to try to pitch an age for the earth was Archbishop James Usher. He's famous for this. He was not the only one to do that, but he was the one who gets credit for it. He is the one who gets credit for it, in part due to John Fell, who was coming up with a new draft for the KJV Bible around this time, and he thought that it needed a chronology. He knew his friend Usher was actually working on a chronology, and so he was like, okay, it was Usher's life's work. He was like, I think your chronology is correct. And Usher calculated the age of the earth by adding up the biblical patriarchs and critically using extra biblical sources as well. And so that's the chronology that ends up in those first issues of the KJV. And specifically, Usher would argue that the earth was 6,004 years old and that the world was created approximately on October 23rd. Sometimes you see 22nd in the year 4004 BC. That's beautifully specific. I would think that creation would not be autumnal, but that's my perspective. I don't think it works thematically, but whatever. But Archbishop Usher is not the only person to propose an age. And Will, and you and I have talked about, you're sort of erring more on the 10,000-year-old age, which other theologians through the years have also proposed. It's critical, though, to note that because Usher's was the one that made it into the KJV, that was the chronology that ended up in the homes of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people, of Christians who were living in the West, in Europe, and in the UK around this time. So this ends up being a really major reason as to why so many people were young Earth creationists at this time. And of course, the idea persists today, and you see young Earth creationism still around.
Yeah. Real quick on Usher. I have his annals somewhere on my bookcase. I really like this. Huh?
Have you read them? Not
all of them.
I bet that's crazy to get through. I've read some of these guys, not Usher, but I've read people from around his time's work, and some of it's hard to decipher. So credit where credit is due.
Yeah, I'm going to say something real quick. Again, I don't know if any creationists are watching, but I have actually a personal goal of mine. And I know this is going to sound big, but I want to get answers in Genesis, ICR, CMI. Donnie, if you're watching, I would love to get them off of this. And the reason why is something which I can't go into right now, but it's called textual criticism, which is understanding which manuscripts are more reliable for our Bibles. And there are major discrepancies in the chronologies in Genesis among the different manuscripts. So the English Bibles today, almost exclusively, the Old Testament is based on what's called the Hebrew Masoretic text. But we've got older manuscripts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint. We can look at people like Josephus and the Samaritan Pentateuch. They have different ages for these people. And when you look at the ages in those texts, which are older, and you compare it to the Masoretic text, the Masoretic looks wrong. So I actually think that a lot of these ages are wrong in our English Bibles today, and that the number is higher than 6,000. Now, it's not going to be enough to excite someone like you, but I do think that the creationists have latched on to this number, this very specific 6,000 number that I think is clearly wrong, and I think it's hurting them. So anyway, I'll be working on that in the background.
Okay. Hey man, if you can, pull them to like 10, and then I'll swoop in and pull them to 4.5 billion. So around this time, right, the Enlightenment is coming. I've said the cusp of the Enlightenment or edge of the Enlightenment like 1,000 times so far, and it's going to bring change with it, right? Challenges to this concept of species fixity and to the age of the Earth are brewing, and a lot of this is going to come from like groundbreaking discoveries that are going to decimate the support for the 6,000-year-old Earth within the scientific community. I'm not under the delusion that consensus equals truth, but I think it's worth noting that this sort of abandonment of young Earth creationism happens way earlier than I suppose I had always given it credit for. Now, you're familiar with this. The heliocentric universe comes in and replaces geocentrism. This represents a major paradigm shift from theistic to naturalistic bases for how we interpret the world. But this is going to take many years to come to full fruition. Heliocentrism is going to be pitched first by Copernicus and then by Galileo. Again, they independently discovered this. The Greeks had proposed it earlier. Other people in other parts of the world had proposed it. But I digress. Social roles and politics are also beginning to play a pretty major role in how people interact with science. Women are starting to insist on a right to education. Abolitionist movements are kicking off in the UK, and democracy is taking the stage in some parts of the world, including a little ramshackle group of colonies overseas in North America. Now, fossils are going to be what sets the stage for the major paradigm shift in geology. And part of this is because there was this debate that was going on that was news to me, but around the 1600s, 1700s, people were not sure what to make of fossils. They looked like living things, But there was a genuine back and forth as to whether they were really biotic, like of biotic origin, or whether they were just like sports of nature. So you get guys like Robert Hooke, you get guys like Steno, you get guys like John Ray. These guys come in and they just immaculately make a scientific case for an organic origin for fossils. But what was really interesting is that all three of these guys are sort of dipping a toe in the natural theologies that the likes of William Paley are going to further popularize with the watchmaker argument and things like that. They're trying to find a way to make sense of the natural world in light of scripture. And at this time that these guys are coming around and proposing their ideas for fossils, flood geology, or as I prefer the name diluvialism, is coming onto the main stage. But what was so interesting to me about reading the works, and these are some of the guys who I'm talking about reading their actual stuff. You can read Hooke, you can read Steno, you can read John Ray. They'll talk all about natural theology, but they do not think that a global flood could be responsible for the entire geologic column. It was simply too disparate, too vast to be attributable to a single event. These are guys that are, again, living and writing before the very first flood geologist who's going to come next. The first flood geologists or diluvialists are going to come in the form of Thomas Burnet. He writes The Sacred Theory of Earth in 1681. Then you got John Woodward. He does something similar in 1695. And then William Winston. But what's really fascinating to me as somebody who's interested in creationism is that none of these guys believed like modern creationists do. All of them believed in some form of gap theory or day-age theory, which are these two theological perspectives that try to make sense of what was fast growing in the eyes of people living during this time to be a vast past, kind of lurking with much more time than the 6,000 to 10,000 years that some people were pitching. But they're flood geologists all the same. They believe in a global flood. They believe that the global flood is responsible for most, if not all, of the geologic column. But they also believe that organisms lived during a vast period of time prior to Genesis 1-2. In the case of, I think it was Winston, who believed that the 6 days of Genesis weren't literal days. They were actually each a year long, which is an interesting spin on what you usually see. A lot of this is going to change with the very first geologists, particularly James Hutton, but throwing a bone to Giovanni Argiuno, to Johann Lehmann, to George Fuchsel, and to Jean-Étienne Guittard. James Hutton is going to really revolutionize everything with the theory of Earth, which he publishes 2 years before his death in the year 1795. And the story goes like this. Hutton spent a lot of time looking at rocks. He was a medical doctor by trade, if memory serves, but he was fascinated by geology and specifically by the publications that were coming out by these guys, by Hooke, by Steno, by Ray, by the hidden potential deep history of the Earth. And what really sells him on this, so the story goes, is when he's walking along Hadrian's Wall, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, which was a wall that was built by the Romans. And he looked at this wall and he looked at the stones that made up this wall. And as you can see in the picture there, it's still in pretty good condition. The stones still fit together with one another pretty dang well. And at this time, we had the history of the Romans, and Hutton knew when Hadrian's Wall was supposedly built. And he looked at Glen Tilt, the region on which he was standing, and he saw a vast discrepancy. Because if Hadrian's Wall had been built hundreds to thousands of years beforehand, and only a scant amount of erosion seems to have taken place, it still seemed in pretty good condition. How long was erosion happening to create the gully that he was standing in, the vast valleys that he was currently standing in? This is what kicks Hutton off studying geology, and he starts documenting slow processes of every type: deposition, erosion, sedimentation, things of that nature. And he publishes it in Theory of Earth in 1795. And one of my favorite quotes by him is that of Earth's history, he says, it has no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end. This was pretty controversial. But people, taking a break, I should say, from geology, people are also trying to suss out the natural world, and organizing the diversity of life becomes a famous pastime of gentlemen naturalists, as well as trying to suss out the human place within it. Edward Tyson becomes the father of comparative anatomy when he dissects a zillion animals and publishes on the anatomy of all of them. The big reason why I bring him up here is because he was the first person that we know of in the West to dissect a chimpanzee. And he famously comes out and he's like, I don't really know what to do with this, but chimps share more with humans than they do with monkeys. And that extends to their brains. He hemisected the brain and dissected the brain of a chimpanzee. And he was like, it is more like man than it is like a rhesus macaque. And that's going to influence Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy and systematics, who comes next. Neither of these men are evolutionists because evolution doesn't exist yet. They're both creationists. And in the case of Linnaeus, he wanted to organize creation by cataloging nature. And he's the one that comes up with Systema Naturae, or the system of nature, which is this classic system that we all know and love. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And there's a zillion little subcategories hidden away, suborders and infraphyla and superfamilies and so on and so forth. But he uses this as a means by which to categorize the world around them, as a means by which to understand God and creation better. And he establishes the use of binomial nomenclature, which is the sort of Latin or Greek, in some cases, if memory serves, way of naming animals. Panthera pardus, right? That's the name of the leopard. Homo sapiens, that's the name of humans. And he notes that these organisms that he's cataloging seem to nest within one another. Something doesn't outgrow its previous category. Categories get more specific, but new categories don't overwrite previous ones. The panther, or rather the leopard that you can see here, is a member of the genus Panthera, but it's also a member of the family Felidae, and it's also a member of the order Carnivora, and it's also a member of the class Mammalia, and so on and so forth. And Linnaeus becomes the first person to name humans too.
Sorry, can you go back?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. By the way, again, if you would rather punt this or talk about it in a future lesson, that's fine.
Please.
I remember the exact person who told me this, and I remember exactly when. Are you familiar? You might be too young. Are you familiar with a documentary called Expelled?
Oh, I am. Yes.
Okay. In that documentary, there's a guy named Dr. Berlinski, and he said something, and I've never forgot it. He said, "We don't know what a species is." And that was fascinating to me because it just is like such a shock statement. And so I've looked into it, and I have two issues. Maybe they're not relevant, although I think they might be.
No, I think they will be. Pitch them.
Okay.
You're going to be preaching to the choir, though. My audience knows how I feel about species.
Okay, yeah. So I feel like the modern definition of a species, which is the ability to procreate fertile offspring, is highly problematic because it doesn't include so much life that we have.
I agree.
Okay, so that's one issue. The second issue I have is if we use that definition, then my issues are going to come into your field of paleoanthropology and how we are assigning species based on fossils when we don't know if they had the ability to procreate.
Oh, man. Yeah, this is why there are 20 plus species concepts. Zacco's 2016 rather is my favorite piece of work on the subject. Species are not biologically real, not in my opinion. And the reason is because there's too many violations to the biological species concept, right? Lions and tigers can produce fertile offspring. No one would look at them and say that they're the same species. American paddlefish and Russian sturgeon, same thing, right? African and Asian elephants, same thing. And yet we consider these to be separate species. Likewise, we consider some things to be the same species, despite the fact that they are members of the same genus or the same species, despite the fact that they're incredibly disparate from one another. I mean, species is not a real biological concept, in my opinion, and I think I can defend that by what you just said. There is no definition that can universally apply to species in the present and in the past. But that is what we expect from evolutionary theory. Because if species are constantly blending into one another, or I should say populations of organisms are constantly blending in and out of one another, it should be impossible to delineate where one species ends and another begins. And we're going to talk about that here with Darwin in a second. I have an analogy that I really like to use for it. But yeah,
Awesome.
You'll find a friend with me with species.
Right.
Species are useful as a concept. We need them because how else can we discuss groups of organisms with ease? But it's a human concept. It's a way by which we bin things to make it understandable to us. But nature doesn't care about what's understandable to us. It does what it's going to do.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So here's Systema Naturae in action, right? All of these animals you can see at the top. We have an ostrich, we have a dog, and we have a human, me, actually. All of us belong to the kingdom Animalia because we have the characteristics that defines the kingdom Animalia, right? We have a cell membrane instead of a cell wall, so on and so you go down the list. There's like a million things. We belong to the phylum Chordata, all of us, check. We all have a nerve cord. When you reach the class level, however, we start to split. Me and a dog both have hair, and females of our species produce milk. And we have a dentary squamosal joint and 3 inner ear bones, whereas none of those apply to birds or to an ostrich in particular. So at this point, the group split. And now, even though me and a dog both share all the traits that make a mammal, Aves becomes, or Aves, depending on how you pronounce it, becomes the class for ostriches. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't all still share the same phylum and the same kingdom. It just means that once we reach the class level, we start to differ. Then when we reach the order level, me and the dog split from one another, right? Dogs are carnivorans, humans are primates. So we have the characteristics that define a primate. Whether you include humans as primates or not, the same characteristics will define the group, whereas dogs have the group or the characteristics that define carnivores, and ostriches have the characteristics that define the order Struthoniformes, which that's the first time I think I've said that out loud in a long time. And then we have our specific families, Struthionidae, Candidae, and Hominidae. And then we have genus Struthio, genus Canis, genus Homo, and then species Struthiocamelus, Canis lupus, and Homo sapiens. And that's all taxonomy is. It's how do we categorize organisms to the best of our ability. This is how it works. Now, Linnaeus was fascinating because he was a strict essentialist. Later in his life, he's going to soften a little bit on whether or not he thinks species can change. But for most of his life, he holds to that quote that you can see on your screen there. We count as many species as different forms were created in the beginning. Species haven't changed. The same species that inhabit the earth now inhabited the earth 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. He correctly assessed many animal groups, including grouping apes with humans in a group he called anthropomorpha, which pissed a lot of people off. But his response to them was, and he put this out openly, is he was like, if you can think of one anatomical characteristic to not include humans in anthropomorpha, which ends up becoming the order primates, he's like, I'm listening. He's like, but I've dissected a zillion of these guys and I can't find one. Unfortunately, Linnaeus also incorrectly proposed that race or varieties were clear biological distinctions that existed between humans, which they aren't. But change is on the horizon. Because in 1812, I think it was, a young woman is crawling the Dorset coast with her family, and they stumble across an impossible monster, something that truly cannot be explained. Mary Anning is a famous paleontologist, fossil collector, scientist of the 1800s, of the Enlightenment. And she is the woman where this little rhyme comes from. She sells seashells by the seashore. She is most famous for discovering, first along with her family, and then on her own, a myriad of different fossils, right? She discovers Ichthyosaurus, she discovers Plesiosaurus, she discovers Pterodactylus, or pterodactyls as we understand them now. And unfortunately, she never really gets credit for any of that because she had this horrible condition where she was like a woman and women were not allowed to be in the Geological Society of London at that time. But this was a huge game changer. I don't think people appreciate just how big a deal fossils were in the early 1800s, because prior to Mary Anning's discoveries, as well as Georges Cuvier's, who we're going to talk about here in a moment, the only fossils we had were like small marine things like ammonites and trilobites and brachiopods, right? These were animals that looked really similar in a lot of cases to living things. And so we could kind of write them off as like, well, you know, maybe they still lived somewhere. Like maybe they fossilized, but like they're probably still alive somewhere in the world. The concept of extinction did not exist. And that came from a theological concept that was really, really rampant at this time, called the plenitude of creation, which is this idea that because God created everything very good in the beginning, animals can't just disappear forever. They've got to be found somewhere on the earth. And this was exemplified, funnily enough, by Thomas Jefferson, who, upon finding mammoth bones in the United States, specifically in Big Bone Lick National Park, or what's now known as Big Bone Lick, it might be a state park. I think it's a state park. He's like, oh my God, these clearly belong to some kind of gigantic, monstrous elephant. Keep an eye out, Lewis and Clark. They're probably still out west somewhere. He genuinely thought that these things were still in existence. But when Mary Anning and those like her are pulling up these marine reptiles, now we have a little bit of a problem, because these don't look like anything that's alive today. When ichthyosaurs were first pulled from the stone, the best we could do was like some naturalists were like, they look kind of like cave salamanders. But other than that, they were completely unique and they were huge. I mean, this ichthyosaur was like, I think it was like 12 to 13 feet long, I believe. I mean, it's big. This changes the game, because what this says to people is that there were once monsters that swam in the seas, and we don't know where they went. So as species are fixed, how do we make sense of the existence of fossils of species that no longer walk the earth? That became the question. And this is going to be answered in many different ways by many different people. Mary Anning's going to try to answer it. William Buckland's going to answer it. George Cuvier, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Charles Lyell, Thomas Malthus. They all have these explanations for what they think happened. Because in some cases, as you can see in the bottom right there, these are mammals. These are giant sloths. These are critters that look a lot like things that still exist. But in other cases, like Mary Anning's marine reptiles or some of the stuff that George Cuvier was pulling up, they didn't look anything like anything that walked the earth or swam the earth today. So William Buckland is a major naturalist of this time, and he is feeling the tension because around this time period, you also have a lot of deists who are getting a lot of popularity and a lot of sort of atheist thinkers who are getting a lot of popularity, and they're sort of trying to co-opt in some ways the science that's coming down the pipeline. And so William Buckland wants to head that off at the pass. So he publishes Vindiciae Geologiae, Geologiae, yeah, I was right the first time, or the connexation of geology with religion explained. And he publishes this in 1820. So just like 8 years after Mary Anning's marine reptiles start to come to light. And in it, he starts doing some of the first really cool, like, field explorations. So he finds this place called Kirkdale Cave, which was there in the UK, and it's just full of these cave hyenas. And so initially, when Buckland finds Kirkdale Cave or starts trying to write up Kirkdale Cave and make sense of what happened in there, he attributed it to the global flood. He was like, whatever put these hyenas there, they were probably washed in by the global flood. The diluvialists still have a lot of ground here. But he's actually going to come around later after investigating Kirkdale Cave, a little bit more in depth. And we're going to meet the character that causes that here in a moment, that the flood could not be responsible for these hyenas. And so that leads Buckland to ask this question, okay, well, if it wasn't the flood, then what did kill them all? Because it's just decades and decades and decades of hyena skeletons and everything they ate piling up in this cave. Cuvier is going to come in and change all that. George Cuvier is quoted here saying, "No one would have ever dreamed that there were successive epochs in the formation of the globe." Cuvier is considered the father of paleontology and of extinct animal comparative anatomy, and he's going to be the guy that helps establish extinction as a fact. Around the same time that Mary Anning is pulling up all of these fossils in Dorset at Lyme Regis, Cuvier is doing this like globe-trotting investigation of every time someone is like, hey, I found a weird fossil, he's there, or they send it to him, and he looks at it, and because he's a comparative anatomist, literally sitting in the museum in France, in Paris, he's able to sit there and compare and find out whether or not the stuff that he's looking at looked like anything living or whether it was something really unique. And George Cuvier is going to come across the teeth of the mystery proboscidean or mystery elephant that Thomas Jefferson had been ranting and raving about. And he's going to be the first one to look at these teeth and say, this is elephant-like, but it's not perfectly like an elephant. This is actually something very different. And it reminded him of some giant's bones that had been published from some explorers who had found other proboscidean mammoth and mastodon remains from a Siberian expedition. And he was like, these aren't giant bones. These belong to some kind of giant creature, but not a giant human or anything like that. He follows leads on pterodactyls. He follows leads on other marine reptiles that weren't Mary Anning's. And he goes and collaborates with numerous naturalists in the UK. And he basically sits back and he looks at all of these creatures and he says, these are gone. These are extinct. They're, he has a French word for it. It's like a species. It's like lost species in French. That's the word. And he's like, they've disappeared. And the reason why is not singular. You can't attribute all of them to a single disaster because the conditions in which these bones are being found are all disparate. Some of them are desert-like, some of them are marine, some of them are mountainous, and they're all different critters, but they're consistently found in the same layers as other sort of index fossils, right? Or fossils like grouped together in both stratum and in locality. So in both where they are up and down on the geologic column and where they are on the surface of the earth. So Cuvier's answer to this is that he's like, I think that the earth has undergone multiple major catastrophes. This is the idea that he puts forward is called catastrophism. He says that over and over and over again, the world has experienced these global massacres of life, whether they're from, they didn't know about asteroids at the time, but volcanic eruptions or earthquakes or sea level rise or great floods. But Cuvier didn't think there was just one. He didn't think one could explain it. He would document these stratigraphic layers, and he was like, it doesn't make any sense to me. But what's interesting about Cuvier is he didn't think that these species were changing over time. He thought God or some kind of deity. I don't know if Cuvier was a deist or not. I can't find him talking about God specifically, like the Abrahamic God. But he was a big proponent of the fixity of species. He didn't think species could change. He thought that what was actually going on here is that someone was coming down ever so often and repopulating the Earth. The Earth would experience demise, and then it would experience an Edenic repopulation. Progressive creation was his idea. Now, Cuvier has an enemy, and his name is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, because Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is going to come along, and he likes Cuvier's idea. And all of these fossils that are showing up has people dreaming about this antediluvian past, a world before the flood. But at this point in time, very few people are considering the sort of flood geology that was pitched by Brunet and his colleagues. It's taking on a different form due to the likes of Cuvier and Buckland. Lamarck is quoted here as saying, it's not enough to discover and prove a useful truth previously unknown, but that it is necessary to also be able to propagate it and get it recognized. And Lamarck this is an ironic quote for Lamarck because one of his ideas kind of ironically holds true to this day. Him and Cuvier hate each other because Lamarck sees this disparate nature of the fossil record as evidence that forms have been themselves changing over time. He advocates for evolution, but he calls it something different. It's sort of like the transmutation of species. And he thinks that it's happening not deistically, but naturalistically. Now that in and of itself is fine. Most gentlemen naturalists of this time were Christian, and most of them believed in and utilized methodological naturalism. I've got about 6 gazillion quotes for you if you want them of these prominent flood geologists, prominent theologians who moonlighted as scientists who were saying, if we have to appeal to a miracle, it's not science, and so we're not going to do it. Lamarck is going to coin the term biology, and he's going to pitch the theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics as a means by which to explain why species are changing. The basic gist of it is this. Lamarck says that if organisms use a particular character, that character is going to become emphasized in that individual. And then when that individual has kids, the kids will inherit that emphasized characteristic. And the example that he always uses is giraffes. He's like, you have giraffes, and giraffes want to reach a high leaf. So they stretch their neck as hard as they can. They maybe get it a tiny little bit longer. And then sometimes they reach the leaf and sometimes they don't. But then they pass on that slightly longer neck to their kids. And then the same thing happens with their kids. And then eventually, after enough generations, you have long-necked giraffes. He called this the use-disuse theory, or we consider it today as Lamarckism. A trait acquired by an animal during its lifetime can be passed on to its offspring. And he felt that he had support for this because look at the animals of the world. Moles dig underground and they don't have eyes, right? Fish live in the water and they don't have lungs. Or animals that live on the land, walk on the land, and so they don't have gills. It seemed like an intuitive idea, if not for the fact that bodybuilders don't give birth to buff babies, right? Like his idea ran into immediate trouble with direct observations of parent-child relationships.
Now, Erica, real quick.
Yeah,
he was influential on Darwin, and I'm pretty sure Darwin bought into Lamarckism. One of the things I read, which I thought was fascinating, is that Darwin was telling a colleague that he was watching bears eat in like a river, and he was like, if that bear is constantly opening its mouth, I could see after a long period of time that the mouth will get bigger and bigger and bigger and eventually be a whale. And so yeah.
So that's super close to the example. It's what he actually proposes is that he watches bears spend a lot of time in the water. And since they're hunting in the water all of the time, he thinks that if they continually tend to get a benefit from living in semi-aquatic habitats, that over time, individuals will spend more and more time in the water, get more resources, have more kids who will then do the same thing. And then maybe that's where whales come from. And funnily enough, he publishes that, I think it was in the first draft of Origin, but because he received so much pushback for it, he removes it later on because he says to himself, you can find his correspondence about this topic in the Letters to Darwin project, but he'll talk about how he was like, yeah, he's like, I do think it's still a feasible idea, but like, it's just amusing. He's like, I shouldn't put it in there because it was just like me musing about something without any support for it. And the great irony is that as far as whale evolution goes, what Darwin proposes is pretty dang close to what actually is proposed to have happened, except instead of bears, it's artiodactyls. But we can cross that bridge when we come to it. He did like Lamarck, though. And what's funny is that he was exposed to nothing but Paley because the UK hated Lamarck. The UK just absolutely hated Lamarck. One of the biggest insults that you could give to a gentleman naturalist during this time is to call their science French science. That was like the death knell. You did not want to be associated with the French, despite the fact that they were down with Cuvier. So I think it was mostly just they really hated Lamarck. And so Darwin ends up getting exposed to Lamarckist ideas while being a part of this club at a school he was attending when he was like 16 or 17 called the Plinian Club or Plinian Club. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I've only ever read it. And when he sees that, he's like, okay, now that's interesting. And the reason he thought it was interesting is because another character that we'll meet here in a moment was saying the same thing. So it's not just Lamarck, it's a couple of scientists who are proposing that species might be able to change over time. And if you read Darwin's writings, that's what he takes away from Lamarckism. He absolutely hates the mechanism, which is why he proposes his own in Origin, 30, 40 years later. But yeah, yes, you are generally correct in that story that Darwin did get inspiration from Lamarck, and he does propose. It's not a Lamarckian idea, though, because he doesn't think the bears are opening their mouths wider and then becoming whales. He pitches it through the lens of natural selection, which we'll get to here in a moment. Do you need a bathroom break or anything?
Oh, no, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to text my husband and ask him to bring me some more water because my mouth is dry. How are you doing? Are you doing okay? You holding up?
Yeah.
It's a lot
definitely.
of info.
No, I really appreciate this. It's been really good. I think
Interesting?
it's safe. Oh, very interesting. Yeah, I think it's safe to say that 95% of this is new to me.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. That's phenomenal. That's exactly what I was hoping for. So I hope the Darwin stuff is going to be particularly interesting because I think the case that Darwin makes is very straightforward. And I think that that's why most creationists are cool with the basic ideas, but we'll get there when we get there. So around the time of Lamarck and Cuvier, and all these guys are butting heads with each other, and everybody's trying to make sense of the fossils, you get this guy, Thomas Malthus, who comes along, and he writes an essay on the principle of population. He's an economist. Like, what is he doing here in a conversation about science and about nature? Well, Malthus brings a very disturbing prospect to the general public. He basically notes that, oh yeah, thank you. Sorry, my husband's giving me water. He brings to the public's attention the fact that the global population is still rising, and it's been rising for a long time. And he brings everyone's attention to the fact that if the population continues indefinitely, eventually there's not going to be enough for everybody to eat. He says the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. And this is very scary because it means that eventually you're going to reach a population crisis and a population crash. And he supports this notion, or this notion rather is supported by looking around at all of these different societies that have gone face to face and toe to toe with famine, which is immediately lighting a fire under everybody who's living in the UK's butt because they're like, okay, we need to establish like a better means by which to control our food consumption, or we're going to fall victim to disease and famine and death and things of that nature. And Malthus is particularly popular because he's like, and guess who this is going to hit first? It's going to hit poor people before it hits rich people, as that is his economist in him. So it's like, what does this have to do with anything? And you're going to see shortly, because when I was pitched Malthus, when I was taking these classes, I was like, what the hell is he doing here, Meanwhile, William Buckland, our old friend who worked with Kirkdale Cave, has a student. He's taken on a student, and that student's name is Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell is fascinated by geology, and he loves the work of Cuvier, and he loves the work of his mentor, William Buckland. So he takes it upon himself to go on a big geological expedition with a group of naturalists who were making their way from the UK all the way over to Italy and through the French Pyrenees and so on and so forth. And Lyell brings a notebook with him and starts taking notes. Charles Lyell, along with James Hutton, is considered the father of geology because of the concept that he introduces. Charles Lyell pitches uniformitarianism. Everywhere he goes, he sees the signs of great geologic change, from these vast gorges scoured out by ancient glaciers to sea levels that have risen in the past, as evidenced by barnacles on the tops of old ruins, which is something that he noticed at the Temple of Serapis, to little cracks in the mud that was hardened beneath his feet, like complete solid stone with raindrops in it and ripples. He basically looks at the world around him and he says, I think that the same things that are happening today have been happening for a very long time. And the same processes that are happening today shaped the world of the past very, very slowly. He calls this idea uniformitarianism, that the same natural laws and processes that operate in our present day scientific observations have always operated in the universe and in the past, and they apply everywhere where they are found. Here's a picture sort of illustrating it. You can see some fossilized ripples and some fossilized mud cracks there on the left, and then some modern day mud cracks there on the right. If they harden in the sun and then they're covered up by additional slurry, they'll eventually or not permineralize because it's not of biotic origin, but they will eventually lithify and form a record of that ancient environment. And Lyell, to him, that was the key of understanding geology. So he publishes Principles of Geology, writes all of this up, and that is a game changer. He actually publishes it before Cuvier dies, and I think Cuvier ended up reading it, but Lyell's work in particular changes the mind of Buckland. It changes the mind of like essentially I'm trying to think of the Gideon Mantell. It changes the mind of Richard Owen when Owen comes along. Like a bunch of different people who had previously had this idea that Cuvier's catastrophism might be the reason why the geologic column looks the way that it does. Everyone left that in favor of Lyell, and uniformitarianism becomes the dominant idea in geology. And the reason is because if you read Principles of Geology, it's just a million examples. He just sits and he's like, I see this happening in the present day. Here's where I saw it in the geologic record. This is happening in the present day. Here's where I saw it in the fossil record.
So I hear scientists talk today and refer to themselves as uniformitarian. So I think that this has really stuck today, to this day. But as an outsider looking in, and if I'm interpreting this, let me know. I feel like secular science claims to be uniformitarian, but they'll make exceptions when they need to, while at the same time telling creationists they can't appeal to a flood because of uniformitarianism.
Put a pin in that. I think it's the next slide or two, maybe a little bit later. But yes, that's a fair observation to make. And a couple of people are going to have some criticisms of Lyell that Lyell is actually going to take to heart and incorporate in later drafts or versions of Principles of Geology. Here are a couple more examples of uniformitarianism in action. Again, you can see these ancient ripples in shallow seas that preserve in the stone, right? You don't see these in tumultuous conditions. You see them in sort of tepid, warm, tidal areas, and they preserve in the fossil record. Or you can see the cobbles that are rolled around in rivers preserved through time. Now, I knew it was within one or two slides. Modern geology is founded on the idea of uniformitarianism, but shortly after Lyell, some individuals, including Charles Darwin, are going to make the same note that you made, which is that not every process is slow and gradual. A lot of processes are fast and catastrophic, a la Cuvier. And so while uniformitarianism holds true to today as the basic principle that underlines the overwhelming majority of geology, modern geologists will tell you that they are actualists, which is general uniformitarianism combined with local catastrophism, right? It allows for those local events like mudslides, like volcanic eruptions, like floods. But the problem is, and this is why I would pose to a creationist, and this is the same conversation that Lyell and Darwin had with some of the sort of waning flood geologists of their time. I'm struggling to remember their names off the top of my head. One of them wrote Scriptural Geology. I'm sure it's in my notes somewhere. But they were like, okay, the problem is these events that occur today leave a mark. We can all agree that a mudslide leaves a particular mark that is diagnosable as a mudslide. Same thing with a volcanic eruption. It spits ash everywhere, and you can quite literally find ancient ash layers throughout the entirety of the geologic column. This is just the nature of geology of the natural world, is that things happen and they leave a trace of themselves. So Lyell and others like him would go on to say, and this is the same problem that we saw with Fuchsel and with Hutton earlier, if there was a global flood, where's the signature? Because these guys were documenting local floods all the time, right? That's the central concept behind actualism. And this has been happening in the century since as well. I should say probably mostly in the century since it's hard to observe a local catastrophe. You can't plan on them. They kind of just have to happen, and then you show up and try to document it. Although Darwin is going to be an exception to this rule because he witnesses a local catastrophe on the voyage of the Beagle. But you have to be able to make the case that a specific catastrophe is responsible. So it's like, yes, uniformitarianism is typically the stance that a geologist is going to take for the majority of geologic formations. Fairly, I think, because unless you have reason to think otherwise, or the signature is found in from multiple different causes, then you're going to go with what it looks like, which is, the ancient mud cracks that we find were very similar to where modern day mud cracks form. The same goes for catastrophes like mudslides, submarine or terrestrial volcanic eruptions, local floods, and so on and so forth. If you find a flood today, we can find those signatures in the past, and we have. An example that I like to use all the time is the Washington Scablands, which was one of the best examples that we have of a mega flood, truly an enormous flood. But even it has limits, and you can denote those limits in the geologic record. We can talk about more of that. We can talk about that more later as well.
Okay, is this your last slide on uniformitarianism?
No, I have one more, I think.
Okay, so I'll just say this. If you could go back. So I'm seeing here the distinction with general uniformitarianism and local catastrophism.
Bingo.
When I hear secular science state that an asteroid killed all the dinosaurs and so much life on the entire Earth, I don't consider that local. And so I don't see much of a distinction between creationists saying a flood killed most life on Earth and science saying an asteroid did. And so to me, that's an example of where science is like, we're uniformitarians, but we won't when we need to get out of it.
I mean, I think I would disagree with that, because a global flood is defined by its global nature. But the asteroid impactor event that is responsible for a lot of the dinosaurs' extinction, the non-avian dinosaurs' extinction, like these days, it's considered to be responsible for a lot of it, but it's also in combination with the Deccan traps, which is this massive string of volcanic eruptions that were going on over in India during this time period. And part of the reason why scientists were looking for additional causes for the extinction of the dinosaurs is because of exactly what we were just talking about. The asteroid hit one side of the planet. Even if it does choke out the atmosphere, how does it kill every single dinosaur? And it's because even though the local area is half of the hemisphere, a half hemisphere, it's still local compared to a truly global event that impacted every single organism on the planet. And it's also very rare, right? Like when I say actualism, I'm talking about run-of-the-mill geologic formations, right? If I go, I live in a southern state that has a lot of different geologic formations that are Ordovician. So it's like I can go down to my local fossil trail and I can pick around and find trilobites, and I can find little ripples and all sorts of things like that. But you can also find really immaculately, preserved animals that were quite quick. So it's like, how did they end up buried in sediment so quickly? That's like, well, a submarine landslide. That happens all the time today. In fact, every time there's an earthquake, we can document submarine landslides that can and do subsume entire ecosystems within them. And those ecosystems will eventually end up preserved for the future. This is something that we see happening today. So it's like, that's a local event or a local catastrophe. A mudslide is a local catastrophe. A volcanic eruption is a local catastrophe, even though some of those do have global consequences, right? There's a volcanic eruption that famously, I think it was the year without a summer. It was in when was it? It was 18 or 1900s. I can't remember the year, but it's there was a big major volcanic eruption and it spat so much ash into the atmosphere that it cooled the entire globe for 2 years. It's is that a global event? Well, it has a global impact, but the event is still a local volcanic eruption. And those are very different things from proposing that a single flood, one event that lasted 40 days and 40 nights, but then it took really a year to fully subside. That's one thing. And so I would propose that these are definitely different, but they're similar in the sense that catastrophes do happen. So I will give you that.
Okay.
How's
Fair
that
enough.
sound?
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So people saw principles of geology and they were like, if Lyell is right, Earth's pretty old. Here are a couple of examples of uniformitarianism as a principle in action. So basically formations that we have today that if we're taking present day processes occurring in that region backwards in time, these are the approximate ages. It's old, right? If that's what happens, the Earth is very old. The question then becomes, is that what happened? But this is what Lyell pitched, and people found it very convincing. Scholars at this time overwhelmingly ditched catastrophism in favor of Lyell's uniformitarianism. And I will add that even the catastrophism that they believed in was not a young earth creationism, right? Like Buckland and Cuvier and those who were sort of in their circles had this idea of like day age theory or gap creationism, where it's like there was a lot of time hidden away somewhere, because they just couldn't understand why all of these enormous animals, which were showing up all over the place, like why no one was talking about them in the written human record. That was really a lot of it. So Lyell's concepts of uniformitarianism get incorporated into the natural theology that reigns at that time. Creation, in the mind of the public and in the mind of the scholars, becomes something that was thought to occur kind of in stages. You have dinosaurs and primordial animals, and those guys probably lived during an earlier iteration of creation, some people proposed, or before the Great Flood. And you can find tons of art that was made during this time that are titled, like antediluvian times, and you've got these dinosaurs walking around. But all of that being said, even with Lyell talking about how the world geologically is constantly in flux, species still weren't. And that was a solid stance. People weren't giving an inch on that. Here's a little graphic that I made for my students. Here's who's in favor of change, and here's who's in favor of not change. Notably, Lyell, who again proposes uniformitarianism, he kind of sits the fight out. He's like, I don't really have a dog in this fight. I don't know if species are changing or not. So I'm just going to stand over here and see how this ends up, like what actually ends up happening. In favor of change was, of course, Lamarck, and another guy we're going to talk about in a second, as well as Geoffroy St. Hilaire, who you can see there. And then on the right side, we have weighing things in favor of things not changing. You got Richard Owen, you got William Buckland, and you got the heavy hitter, George Cuvier. Erasmus Darwin shows up on the scene, and he does something that's very, very interesting. He basically pitches Lamarckism. Well, not Lamarckism. He pitches the transmutation of species without a Lamarckian mechanism. So he's actually Charles Darwin's paternal grandfather. He has a lot of really important works. He's a very successful naturalist. But in Zoonomia, he basically writes, and you can pause this if you like, but this is basically just a big paragraph where he's like, I think the Earth is really old, and I think animals have been changing the entire time along with the rocks. And you would think that he would be crucified for this because Lamarck was absolutely bodied. Like, no one liked his idea. But Erasmus didn't really catch any flack. And I think the reason for that is because he didn't try to propose a mechanism. He basically just comes out and he's like, well, if rocks are changing for all this time, then I could conceive of a world where the animals that live on those rocks are also doing a lot of change. And so people were kind of like, okay, old man, whatever you say. And he publishes it in Zoonomia, and they kind of just leave him well enough alone because he's publishing as you can see, other works that are pretty useful to the scientific community. But this is important to keep in the back of your mind because Darwin had access to these notes. Charles Darwin did. And so when he's exposed to Lamarckian ideas, he thinks back to his paternal grandfather, who also thought that it was a pretty compelling concept, even if they didn't have a mechanism to explain it yet. So, Chucky D. Darwin says it is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. And I think that is such a fundamental concept that in my experience, and this won't be you, Will, I know it won't be, but that I find my students and creationists tend to get wrong all the time, is that this idea of survival of the fittest, people conceive of the fittest as the biggest, strongest, smartest animal, right? Or organism, something that beats absolutely everybody else out by sheer force of will, or by the size of their body, or the size of their teeth, or by their intelligence and cleverness and whatever. But when we look at the fossil record, that doesn't seem to be what always dominates. The organisms that survive the mass extinctions are the ones that are the most adaptable to change. They're the ones that are general. They don't have to eat one specific thing. They can eat a lot of different things. They can survive in a lot of different environments. And indeed, this is a concept that Darwin put forward that people would go on to misunderstand for decades and really centuries. Fitness doesn't mean strength. Fitness means how many kids do you actually leave behind? And in the face of that, how do your traits do in the face of a changing environment? And we're about to see that sort of play out. Darwin was born a rich kid. He was born the fifth of 6 children to affluent parents. He basically lives a pretty nice life of luxury in the UK. He gets sent off to school a couple of different times. First, he goes to medical school, but he actually cannot stand the sight of blood. Like, he's super squeamish, and he couldn't stand the harsh Scottish winters. So he drops out. He ends up back at home, and his dad is like, you are not going to sit around, on your butt all day, not doing anything. He was basically doing nothing but spending time outside, collecting plants, collecting insects. He was a naturalist from the start. But his dad wasn't into that. And so his dad's like, you are going to go to school somewhere. You're not going to be sitting around on my property. So he sends him off to Christ's College in Cambridge, where Darwin is to become an Anglican parson. While there, Darwin becomes fascinated by entomology, which is the study of like arthropods, so like bugs and things like that. And he graduates in the year 1831. One of his colleagues is essentially like, Darwin, you love this kind of thing. You need to beef up your resume, and you're about to become an Anglican parson anyways in the long term. Darwin had been eating up everything that he could find from other naturalists. And in fact, he was a huge fan of some of the big expeditions that people like von Humboldt had gone on. He had all their tomes, and he was reading about their adventures that they had in all these other places. And eventually, Darwin gets this offer that his colleague that I was just talking about ends up telling him to take, to go on a voyage basically around the world. The goal of the voyage was to chart coastlines, but Darwin was to be the gentleman naturalist aboard, and who was going to take samples of the critters and of the geology and of the observations of how people lived from every one of their stops as they went along. And he was to be the conversation buddy, if you will, of the captain of the ship, Fitzroy, who just hated talking to his sailors. So he had a twofold job. He was going to keep the captain happy, and he was going to do a lot of collecting. He decides to go in 1831, and we're going to pause there and look at what people are thinking at the time. The transmutation of species, or this idea that critters can change, can be conceived of as a color gradient, where on the left you have yellow and on the right you have red. Whereas species fixity can be conceived of as sort of a color palette, where you have yellow and you have light orange and you have regular orange and you have dark orange and you have red. The early ideas of how species could change, specifically whether one could become one another and what was maybe involved in that change, all of that was like up in the air. And here's who thought what. When Darwin leaves that year in December of 1831 to go on a voyage that was supposed to last 2 years, but would end up lasting 5. Here's some pictures of Darwin that are moody. Here's the voyage he takes. They leave from Plymouth in the UK, and they sort of cross over the Atlantic. Then they hug the side of South America, come all the way down to the tip, all the way up the other side of South America, cross over Oceania, touch New Zealand, touch a little bit of the oceanic islands, hit Australia, come around on the other side of Australia, cross all the way over to Africa. And then when they're in Africa, the captain is like, we need to do a couple of double checks on our measurements. So they go back over to South America and like recheck a couple of coastlines before they head home. That's the voyage. It lasts 5 years because they're doing it on an old sailing ship. And it is on this voyage that Darwin documents countless organisms, geologic formations like coral atolls, fossils that he collects, and indeed even people groups. With him on this voyage, he received as a last-minute gift to keep him occupied is a copy of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. And that's one of the only things that he has to read on this. So he has a lot of time to mull over Lyell's ideas. One fun fact that I like to teach my students is that on this voyage, Darwin collected a Galapagos tortoise named Harriet, and she died in 2006 at the age of 175. This is a picture of that same tortoise with Steve Irwin. That's crazy that they lived to that long. All right. So what does Darwin do? He collects living animals for study in England. He observes similarities of fossils in South America to similar ones that are living today. We'll talk about that in a second. He notices similarities of the species on the Galapagos Island to the mainland species. Again, we're going to dig into this here in a moment. But he also makes a lot of geological observations. He experiences an earthquake in Concepcion, Chile, where he's like, oh my goodness. He observes in like hours the massive amount of geologic change that can occur because of local catastrophe. And that idea is going to make it all the way back to Charles Lyell, because Darwin and Lyell are going to end up becoming fast friends once he returns from this voyage. He also observes seashells found super far inland, and he infers that rock beds below the sea were elevated to form those mountains. He also hears this rumor when he's in Uruguay that a bunch of local school children or local kids had been sort of like trespassing on this farmer's property where they'd set up this big piece of bone and they were like throwing rocks at it. So Darwin is like, a big piece of bone, that sounds really interesting. He's like, he knows that Cuvier had gotten his giant sloth bones from South America. So he's thinking, well, maybe this is a ground sloth fossil. He goes to check it out, and the bone is a cranium that belongs to an animal called the toxodon. Here's a full skeleton. We've since obviously gotten full skeletons since Darwin just had the skull. And here's what they looked like. Here's what we think they looked like. Very similar to bison, and they've got that big hump to anchor really strong muscles for their necks. But what's really interesting about toxodon is he gets back after the voyage with the toxodon fossil, and it doesn't look like any living mammal. Like, it's not even close to any living mammal. And that's weird because, at least in the case of mammals, most of the mammal fossils had like living relatives. Toxodon, that was not the case. It would turn out that toxodon belongs to an entirely unique order of animals. Remember, primates is an order, or not order, excuse me. Primates is a class. Mammalia is a class. Primates is an order. Yeah, extinct order. I was right the first time. Primates is an order, and carnivora is an order, right? These are big groups of animals. And toxodon was a member of one of those, right? And there were no living members. That was crazy. No wonder he couldn't fit. It haunted him for his whole life. He could never figure out what this thing was related to. And that's because it doesn't have any living close relatives. He also, on the tail end of coming down off the coast of South America, they hit the Galapagos Islands, famously, right? He collects so many birds from the Galapagos Islands. And what I think is really cool about this is when he collects the birds, he doesn't know they're all finches. They all look way, way, way too different to all be finches in his mind. It doesn't occur to him that they're all finches until they get back from the voyage of the Beagle, and he sends those birds off to Robert Grant, who's a famous ornithologist. And Robert Grant comes back and he's like, you're not going to believe this. All of these are finches. They have the characteristics that defines a finch. They're just exaggerated in really weird ways. And so Darwin is like, that's unbelievable. He says, I have stated that in the 13 species of ground finches, a nearly perfect gradation may be traced from the beak extraordinarily thick to one so fine that may be compared to that of a warbler. He's like, these things are changing their appearance depending on where they live. That was like, that's an idea that he's going to sit on for a long time, as you'll soon see. Once they get back from the voyage of the Beagle, again, it's a five-year-long journey. Darwin gets busy. He gets married. He has kids. He publishes on all sorts of like random critters. He gets really into pigeon breeding and publishes on pigeons as a species and pigeon breeds and things of that nature. Obviously, he becomes really good friends with Charles Lyell because on Darwin's journey, first he wanted to share that stuff about the earthquake, but he also had a different idea as to how coral atolls formed that was different than what Lyell had proposed. And so Darwin and Lyell start corresponding on the basis of that too, on the basis of coral atolls and all these geologic observations and phenomena. And Lyell starts introducing Darwin to the other heavy hitters of the naturalist community. And it helps that Darwin is publishing this entire time. Like a lot of really big books on like barnacles or, pigeons or whatever coming out, which, these Enlightenment thinkers, they ate that stuff up. I love this quote from Darwin because I think it humanizes him in a way that I feel all the time. This is a picture of one of his letters that he's written to a colleague. And what it says is, I'm very poorly today and very stupid, and I hate everything and everybody. And it's like, yeah, I get that. All the while, right, for like 20 years, Darwin is sitting on this idea and he's mulling over the finches. For 20 years after he gets back from the voyage of the Beagle, he's moving and shaking with big naturalists. He's hanging out with his family. He's popping out kids. He's sort of being as a gentleman naturalist, right? He's doing his own experiments and so on and so forth. But those finches, he just can't get them out of his mind. Darwin thought back to the Galapagos Islands, and he thought back to the nearest section of South America, which was Ecuador. And he noticed that on those islands, there were those birds, those finches, and those finches had beaks that were adapted for different things. There were thin-beaked ones that could pull grubs out of trees. There were thick-beaked ones that could crush nuts. And there were regular-beaked ones that didn't really specialize in anything. They could eat a little bit of the worms and a little bit of the nuts, but they weren't great at either. They were sort of a jack of all trades. And eerily enough, connected to those species that he saw all across the islands was a generic finch that was found in Ecuador, a finch that looked like the basic version of everything that these finches were doing on these islands in new and exciting ways. So Darwin thinks to himself, okay, let's say you have that mainland finch, and let's say that mainland finch lives in an area that is very close to a bunch of other island finches that do different things. What if they aren't just finches that have been created to do those specific things? What if that mainland finch is actually the ancestor of all of those other finches? And if that mainland finch could be the ancestor of those island finches, it may be the ancestor of even more finch species that we haven't discovered yet. And of course, that would end up being the case, right? We found other finch species that are closely related and doing unique things as well. And Darwin's thinking to himself, well, okay, if the mainland finch can give rise to the island finches, what gave rise to the mainland finch? Some other kind of finch, right? In the past, somewhere. And if a regular finch gave rise to the mainland finch prior to these Galapagos finches, what was before that? And he sits there thinking of this, thinking about how populations of organisms might change over time, because if these finches were all related, they did change over time. The question is, were they actually related? Darwin started thinking, how far back does this go? If finches can change, what's to prevent other organisms from changing too? And if all organisms are capable of change over time, what ends up happening when you take that back is populations converge on common ancestors until eventually you have like one. And Darwin drew this in a sketch from 1837. This is actually he's only been back for like 2 years at this point. And remember, he's going to sit on this idea for 20 more years. He's going to really dot his I's and cross his T's. But he draws this in his book, a tree, a family tree. And he writes at the top the two greatest words that a scientist can write, which is, I think. And I love that because he's not saying it is. He's not saying this is how I know I've discovered this wonderful thing. He says, I think, like, what if, maybe. And so he's going to sit on this for a while. This is what he does for the next 20 years. He just writes and writes and writes. And you'll notice that one book is missing from this very long list of publications from Charles Darwin up to 1859, isn't it? Darwin's on good footing academically at this point, but he's sitting on this idea that's new and it's potentially dangerous. He'd seen what had happened to Lamarck. His own grandfather never got anywhere with it. And so he needs to have a really, really, really good mechanism if he's going to propose that these species can change over time. So he just continues to sit on it. And this is him getting older over time. Meanwhile, and this is like our big, smash cut. Meanwhile, another guy is living and doing his thing. And his name is Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace is like the polar opposite of Darwin in many ways. Wallace is poor. He's one of 9 children. He has horrible luck. His father and his brother die in like quick succession. And he basically has to work these podunk jobs that kind of suck. Unlike all of these other gentlemen naturalists who come from money. And so they have the education and the time to do all of this research. Alfred Russel Wallace had to make his own way. And so eventually Wallace gets it into his head, much for the same reason that Darwin did, which is that they were reading the same really cool expedition logs. Wallace is like, all right, fine. I'm going to become a naturalist. That's what I want to do. And he's sort of urged on to this by some of his colleagues who he would meet like at the library or whatever, and they would discuss the naturalist tomes that they were reading. And Wallace is like, okay, this might also be lucrative because their scam, if you will, and it's not really a scam, but the idea was when they would go on this expedition, instead of taking one of every specimen, they would take more than one of every specimen so they could sell those specimens to museums when they returned. Awesome idea. Totally would have pulled him out of poverty. While he's in Brazil, which he goes there with Henry Bates and Richard Spruce, he collects thousands and thousands and thousands of specimens. And on the way back, the ship catches fire and sinks. And Alfred Russel Wallace is on this lifeboat for several days with the crew, just thinking about how he's wasted 5 years of his life collecting all of these specimens, and now they are in cinders at the bottom of the ocean. And also he might die because they don't know if they're going to get rescued. They do get rescued, thankfully, by an old like an old cargo ship. And then they have to eat rations for several weeks until they can make it back to London. And needless to say, the crew was not happy that they had to take on all these randos they found in the middle of the ocean. But When Wallace returns, he starts talking to the other naturalists, and everybody's like kind of with him that sucks and he's had a really bad experience, but they're like, you might want to get back out there because, you know, nobody's done the Malay archipelago. You could go over there. And so Wallace, against all odds, decides to try again. And this time he starts sending the specimens back like in groups ahead of him, so that if one ship sinks, at least he's still got more. While Alfred Russel Wallace is in the Malay archipelago, he collects more than 125,000 specimens. That's a lot. And while he is in the Malay archipelago, he notices very similar things to what Darwin was noticing, which is that the animals that lived there were very well adapted to the environments in which they lived. Perfectly well suited, one might say. He also notices and discovers this thing called Wallace's line, which is this invisible barrier that seems to stretch across Oceania. And on one side of that line, you have primates, and on the other side of that line, you have marsupials. But the things that they're doing on either side of the line are the same things. They're animals filling the same niche or ecological job, but they're different animals. That's weird. He thought that was weird. So Wallace gets back, and he knows that Darwin has been quietly, it was like an open secret that Darwin's been toying around with this idea that species might be able to change over time. So in 1858, Alfred Russel Wallace sends Darwin a draft of his own version of this idea that species might change over time and why they might be changing it. And he calls it On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type, which, like, I'm glad they went with On the Origin of Species. He sends it to Darwin, though, and Darwin writes in a letter, I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better abstract. They had basically independently converged on the same exact idea. And so they agree to give a joint presentation before the Linnaean Society of London in the year 1858. And then Darwin's going to publish Origin after that. He publishes On the Origin of Species in 1859, and it immediately sells out. It ends up having 6 full editions. The full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Races there is serving the same function as species or breed, which is these guys were, I'm not saying they weren't racist, they were, but this just isn't an example of that. To summarize, multiply, vary, let the strongest live, and the weakest die. That was the driving reason why organisms appeared to change over time. Written in On the Origin of Species. And it's accompanied by this tree, a big family tree where organisms are taken back into time until they eventually converge on common ancestors. Prior to the 1830s, most naturalists had essentialist beliefs, right? Species are composed of similar individuals. They have that are sharing this sort of ethereal essence. Species are really well separated from one another by defined discontinuities. Species are constant through time. They don't change. And there are very stringent limitations as to the possible variation of one species, right? They're distinct creations. That was what was held prior to the 1830s. But Darwin comes in with an evolutionary hypothesis for species change. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. And that'll be the last thing we talk about today. Darwin proposes 5 things. He proposes evolution, or descent with modification. Populations of organisms change over time. Likewise, he proposed common descent. Those lineages of organisms that are changing over time have been changing over time for a very long time, meaning that just as a family tree splits as it grows outward, if you take that back into time, lineages converge, and eventually you will arrive, on a last universal common ancestor. Third, multiplication of species. A species can give rise to new daughter species, to populations of organisms that are recognizably distinct from their parent population. He proposed the idea of gradualism, which is this idea that those changes occur pretty slowly. And finally, he proposes natural selection as the mechanism. Natural selection being differential reproductive success or survival. Dawkins, who I'm not a big Dawkins fan, but he does define it pretty well as the non-random survival of hereditary information through many generations. So let's tease this apart. What does that mean? Natural selection, multiply, vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die. That's in any given environment. So, like, what's good in one environment might not be good in another. Darwin made 5 distinct observations that lead to this conclusion and proposal of natural selection. The first one is that populations can theoretically expand indefinitely. Look at frogs. Frogs have thousands of eggs. They lay thousands of eggs. But we know for a fact that the earth is not crawling with frogs. So not every frog that is born lives to survive or lives to adulthood and lives to reproduce themselves. And the reason is because even though frogs have a lot of babies, resources are limited. So some frogs will survive to adulthood to reproduce, and some frogs will die before they ever metamorphose. That was Darwin's first observation. Populations can expand indefinitely, but resources are limited. Thus, we have a conflict. Observation 2 is that despite observation 1, populations in nature are roughly stable. More offspring are born than seem to survive to reproduce, and yet populations don't crash. This is where that Malthus essay came in. Observations 1 and 2 combine together to form the notion that there must be a struggle for existence. Because a lot of critters are born, and there are a limited amount of resources, not every single one is going to survive to adulthood to reproduce itself. So, if there's a struggle for existence, what factors determine which individuals survive? That led to Darwin's third observation. Individual variation within populations affects the ability of any given individual to acquire resources. Resources mean that you grow up. Resources mean that you get bigger. Resources mean that you survive longer. And resources mean that all that time you're reproducing and passing on that beneficial trait that let you grow up to get big and survive onto your kids. So here are our 3 finches that Darwin observed. Individual variation within populations impacts their ability to acquire resources. If you have a population of finches, some of them are naturally going to have thicker beaks and some are naturally going to have thinner beaks, just as some humans are taller and some humans are shorter. That gives those individuals advantages with some resources. It allows them to get big, have their own kids, and pass that trait on, which leads to observation 4. Variation is heritable, right? Individuals that were born with those thick beaks would have a lot of kids because they could crack the nuts that no other bird could crack. And then when they would have kids, those kids would have thick beaks. And then their kids would have thick beaks. And then their kids would have thick beaks. And thick beaks would come to dominate that population because the individuals without thick beaks didn't survive. They couldn't get big enough. They couldn't reproduce enough. Natural selection, then, is the differential survival and reproductive success that we see within a population. All that means is that individuals within a population, whether it's dogs or humans or finches or butterflies, are going to survive and reproduce at different rates depending on the characteristics that they have. A butterfly that's born with really small wings might survive to adulthood, but it's probably not going to be reproducing nearly as fast as a butterfly with really big wings that let it fly around and gather more nectar and fertilize more eggs. Finally, that led to observation 5. If organisms, what is fit and what allows them to survive and reproduce is dependent on the environment that they live in, and the environment is constantly changing, then organisms will change over time. Because what is benefiting each population is context specific. If nuts grow like super hard in arid conditions, right? So hot, sweltering, dry, and all of a sudden the environment switches to being really moist and the nuts stop having such a thick shell, and instead they start getting infected by fungus, since fungus loves really moist conditions, and all of a sudden now there's way more grubs and fungus than there are nuts. You're going to see a shift in the physical characteristics of the bird population that lives there, not because they want to become something else, but because the individuals that specialized in the nuts die off, and the individuals within that population that have beaks that are slightly better suited for eating fungus or poking through the bark of trees to get at grubs will survive, pass those traits on, and then their offspring will have those same characteristics. If that environment changes again, the population will change again. So if the environment is constantly changing, Darwin reasoned, populations of organisms too are constantly changing. Populations will adapt to their environment via natural selection. Really, what this isn't natural selection, it's natural filtration. It isn't that organisms die because they're not well suited most of the time. Organisms aren't, I should rephrase this better. It's not that organisms are dying in given environments because that environment is like hostile to them. It's that they're not as good at surviving, procuring resources, and reproducing as other organisms which have traits that are beneficial in it. Does that make sense?
It does.
Cool. In other words, if more offspring are produced than survive, those that survive because they are more fit, i.e., better to compete for resources, will leave behind more offspring. Those offspring will resemble their parents and will also tend to leave behind more offspring. Over time, the population will adapt to the changing environment and they will look different. They'll change physically over time as those characteristics proliferate because they're giving some group of animals an edge. So under Darwin and Wallace's idea, the original group of giraffes didn't stretch its neck taller to reach the leaves and grow longer necks. The original group of giraffes had short necks, but within that short neck variation, some necks were longer than others. The ones with slightly longer necks could reach the vegetation that the others couldn't. They got more resources, they grew bigger, they lived longer, they reproduced more, and longer necks starts to be selected for within that population until eventually everybody's got long necks. Not within that like single generation, but as generations pass through time, and that characteristic proliferates. Survival of the fittest. But fittest, again, isn't like big and strong. Fittest is well suited for the environment that you live in. So, evolutionary theory states that populations of organisms form lineages that evolve in response to changes in their environment. And over time, those lineages yield new species. Taken back in time, these populations and species converge to a last universal common ancestor. This includes humans. And as you can see over there on the right, we have two of Darwin's drawings at the top. We have a modern radial phylogenetic tree on the bottom left, and then we have my silly cartoon with some birds there on the right. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species, he bolstered the idea by appealing to people's intuition, because that tends to be what works, right? He said, look at the variation that we see in dogs today. Look at the variation that we see in pigeons. These came from an original stock of pigeons. And in the case of dogs, they came from an original stock of wolves. And yet look how much variation we could get out of these species just by selecting for characteristics. He said, this is artificial selection. We are the intelligent agent selecting for given characteristics. But in nature, abroad, the environment is selecting for characteristics. It isn't that organisms are well suited for their environment because they were designed for it. The environment designed them by culling those that weren't well suited for it, or rather emphasizing, on the other hand, I should say, emphasizing those who were very well suited for it. And this, he argued, could explain biodiversity. Darwin finished On the Origin of Species, his very first edition of it. And at this point, I must say, and I say this to my students as well, Darwin was still a professing Christian when he wrote On the Origin of Species. And for this reason, he finishes the text like this. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that, whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So that's how he sort of sums it up. And I'll add that in the original, this is actually a later version of Origin. In the original version, he has originally breathed into by a creator. So Darwin sees that Origin has enormous success. And its follow-up, which we won't talk about for months, The Descent of Man, is also wildly popular. And I'll note that he had defenders from all across the aisle. Two major ones were Thomas Huxley, who is affectionately called Darwin's bulldog. I think he kind of looks a little like Timothy Chalamet there on the left. And the other was Asa Gray in the United States. Asa Gray is interesting because Asa Gray is the father of theistic evolution. Asa Gray wrote a text called Darwiniana, which defended Darwinism from those who would say that it was anti-biblical or anti-scriptural. He thought that the two things meshed well together. And so he was the first guy to sort of provide a text supporting that in a form of essays. He was also a very famous Harvard botanist, and he's known for his botany as well. Darwin's ideas would also be accepted by his friends Charles Lyell, and in fact, Lyell would include Darwin's concepts in later versions of Principles of Geology, as well as another one of his friends, Joseph Hooker. Holdouts still existed, but by and large, by Darwin's death in 1882, evolutionary theory was the consensus in the scientific community alongside the ancient heliocentric globe-shaped Earth. But questions remained. Natural selection relies on the presence of variation in a population. Everybody knows that. You can see this. If you've ever had a puppy or like a dog have puppies, you can see variation in the puppies, or you can see variation if you grow tomatoes in the size and shape and color of the stems and so on and so forth. There's your variation. Everybody knows variation is in populations. And we also all know that variation is heritable. This is why you look like your parents or your kids look like you. Obviously, here's a picture that I thought was really cool. This is kids taking the same picture that their parents took years later. I mean, these aren't the same people. This is like one generation apart. But how does variation occur in the first place? What is literally going on there, and how is it passed on, right? Darwin has this wonderful idea for how traits proliferate and why, but what was actually going on? No one had a clue. Heritability is just a measure of how well differences in genes explain trait variation. So some traits are going to be highly heritable and some are going to be lowly heritable. I mostly include this for my students in case people don't know what heritability means, but I do think that it's pretty intuitive. People tried to suss out heritability before Darwin. Anton von Leeuwenhoek, he's the father of microbiology, and he made improvements to the microscope, but he's best known for discovering sperm. And there's a very funny story that I tell my students about this, where it's like, because of the sort of Puritan sensibilities of the time, he needed to acquire human sperm in a way that was appropriate. And so he talks about how him and his wife had marital relations, and it's from that he acquired his sperm to look at underneath a microscope. And it was funny because like the scientific community was like, and the church was like, okay, as long as it was, marital coitus, we're good. And he writes about it and he says, I have divers times examined, divers I think means a lot. I've divers times examined the same matter, human semen, from a healthy man immediately after ejaculation, before 6 beats of the pulse had intervened, and I have seen so great a number of living animalcules in it that sometimes more than 1,000 were moving in an amount of material the size of a grain of sand. Gross, but his explanation, I bring this up because his explanation for heritability is that there are just little guys in all the sperm. Like in the head of the sperm, Leeuwenhoek thought that's where a small human lived, and that small human would then develop in the mother. And he called this homunculus theory or preformationism. I think that's really weird. We also had Lamarck's inheritance of acquired characteristics, that maybe traits that seem to be inherited are acquired during an animal's life. But we know that doesn't work because, again, why aren't bodybuilders giving birth to like buff babies? Finally, Darwin had his own idea for heritability. He proposes this concept called pangenesis. Basically, every body part has a different particle. So there's like a liver particle and a kidney particle, and pangenes are produced by organs. So when reproduction happens, the pangenes from men and women will blend together, and then that's how you get an organism that has characteristics from both. He was like, I can't tell you like what the particles are, or like I can't show you under a microscope, and I don't really know if this is legit, but it would explain blending inheritance, which is a form of inheritance in which features of offspring are kind of the average of their parents. But if this was the case, if Darwin was right on this, why aren't siblings identical? What the hell is going on there? Why can siblings look so different from one another? Luckily, the problem of heredity would be solved by a completely new challenger, because while all of this is happening in a quiet little abbey in the Czech Republic, a young Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel is breeding pea plants, and he is about to discover genetics. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. Any questions from you or for anybody else?
Thank you. That was awesome. Obviously, genetics is going to be a big piece. Just to give my perspective real quick on the last portion that you talked about, which is all this variety in the finches that Darwin noticed, all the variety we have in dogs, the variety in pigeons. That to me makes perfect sense with a creator, because if there was a creator, if I was doing it, if I was designing it, it would be so boring if everything looked the same and if there wasn't this variability. And it would also be, I would consider it brilliant to design it in such a way to where if your environment does change, that you would be able to adapt and change as well. So far, it does make sense to me that all of this would happen with a creator. And I know getting into genetics is going to be a big piece of this. And I think that's kind of where we go from Darwinism to neo-Darwinism.
This is why I said to you at the beginning, like when we were first talking about this, I was like, I don't think you're going to take issue with very much that I'm going to say today. It's all pretty boilerplate intro to science history stuff, But the reason why I started with it is because what you just said, I think this makes sense. I think a creator would do it that way. And I think this is fair. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's because you grew up now. Like, you were exposed to modern science. You're exposed to all of this, century plus of data to back that up. When Darwin pitched this in the first place, it was like, wow, that's crazy. Like, it was kind of a no duh moment, which is why it was so popular. But for so long, people just didn't think that that was doable. Animal breeds were sort of the exception to the rule, is what people thought. So I agree. I think it makes perfect sense. And I'm not religious, but at the same time, like, I don't understand why that was such a sticking point for so many people. But the reason is because, like, theologically, I mean, I don't understand, because it seemed to me it would make more sense to have a God who would plot in an organism's ability to react to its environment. But I would propose that if you take that a step further, that's just evolutionary theory, right? Like, and that's what people would end up taking an issue with. But at the time, it was because if God made things very good in the beginning, why would they change? It just goes to show, like, when we're born and how we're born plays such a role in what we're even willing to accept. Which is why when these people step out and they make these claims, and I mean, gosh, so what a mood waiting for 20 years before you pitch your idea. It's like he was terrified of what was going to happen. But hold on, I want to do these super chats, and I also want to hear more of your thoughts. But I have drank 2 of these now, and so I have to pee really badly. Hold that thought. I will be right back. Talk to chat, Will.
Okay. I will talk to the chat for the first time. Just so everyone knows, I told Erica before we started that I was not going to watch the chat for a couple of reasons. One is I'm here to learn, and so I don't want a distraction. But two, a lot of people can be very interesting in online forums where you're not face to face. And I didn't want to read anything that would necessarily bother me while I'm trying to focus on what Erica is teaching me. So for the first time, I'm going to open up the chat and see what people are saying. People are saying hi back. I don't recognize any names yet, but appreciate you joining us and taking part in this. So this is very exciting for me.
Okay, wonderful. All right, let's do these super chats. Oh, no, wait. I want you to continue to tell me any other thoughts you might have. I want you to what if you, oh my God,
Yeah.
I had to let him in. So if you just heard that, my dog is eating a bone and he's like making weird noises. I'm going to pull up the super chats in the interim.
Yeah. Please pull them up. It was awesome. Everything you did was amazing. Thank you so much. The history is so important. I love history, but when you're studying something, understanding how we got there is super important, right? I think we take for granted so much about living now, and we don't realize the lengths that people went to figure things out. Most of us probably wouldn't be willing to do that. And so we are very, very lucky to be living now when we are and have all of the great work from these men in the past to they essentially just fast forwarded time for us because they did the work for us. It took years, it took decades, even centuries. And so I just think it's awesome. And I really appreciate the history lesson there. It was awesome. I've never learned so much of that stuff. So thank you.
Man, it's my pleasure to do it, because to be perfectly honest, for the longest time, I thought that was the most, I said this at the top, I thought it was so boring. I was like, who freaking cares? But what really kind of won me over was a couple of things. One is a book called Impossible Monsters by Michael Taylor. And he basically writes from a personal perspective, like, who were these men and women? Like, what were their lives like? Like, where were they coming from? Who did they love? Like, who did they know? Who were they friends with? Like, what did they like and dislike about the world? And it humanized it so much to me that, I don't know, it got me thinking about, like, how these people came to the conclusions they came to in the areas, in the periods of time that they lived in. And then also, like, it got me thinking about how many times throughout the years we have the same conversation. Because and I was saving this for this video that I'm doing on it, but I'll give you the punchline now. Alfred Russel Wallace, the guy who co-discovered evolution with Darwin, he would end up having a massive feud with a flat earther, like maybe 10 years after he got back, I think. And he's responsible for I'm sure you've heard of the Bedford level experiments. That came from Wallace's clash with a flat earther at the time. And so it's like, he's doing these, he's having these conversations, and it's like, we're still having them. It's so fun to read about what he says. And he's like, I don't know how I'm supposed to explain this to this guy. This is a pretty simple concept. And so what he ends up doing is that he just invites him out, and they do the experiment at the Bedford level, right? And so that's how he ends up convincing. Anyways, the guy came up with a reason. It was like a whole deal. It's a funny story, but we'll save it. All right. Shall we do these super chats?
Let's do it.
All right. I think this is in starred. So, all right. We got Gupdu for $2, snarky and rude. Thank you, Gupdu. I really appreciate that. We have, thank you, Vishanti, for $10. Very kind donation. A little bit too snarky to read. I love you. Very kind, but we're going to say that one. We got AMZ, let's see, AMZ 4233. This is so exciting. Thanks to you both. Our pleasure. This is super fun.
Absolutely.
We got Gitmonger for $20. I'm excited by people learning about evolution. It's such an exciting way to view life because it isn't about category. It's about gathering understanding. My favorite method is the Socratic method, eliciting questions. I also like that. And of course, I'm excited by people learning evolution too.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the Socratic method for sure.
All right, where is Waldo? Thank you for your $10. I don't think this is too snarky. I am going to share this from Where's Waldo. Where's Waldo says stop saying evolutionist. He doesn't like the term evolutionist. So sorry, Will.
What are your thoughts on the term?
I think it's useful in contexts like these, and I think it's historical. I mean, there's a connotation to it. I will say that you rarely find mention of it outside of interaction with the scientific community and creationism. And that's, I think, mostly just because it's consensus.
Interesting. So, okay, I do think that there is a benefit to having terms to distinguish groups of people that you're talking about. And so I'm using it in contrast to creationist for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because I got this with the flat earth stuff too, is I would use the term globe earther or glober, and people said, stop using that term. So
I mean, that's like I said, right? Like, and like I was talking about with species and my feeling on species, right? Like, I think that if it's going to convey information and it's going to make whatever you're talking about more understandable, there's utility in it. That's my opinion.
For sure.
We got Anna the Elephant, 1937 for $2. Proud of you, Will.
Thank you.
We got Norum Dipitz, $2. Drink for historical science versus operational science. Listen, man, it's the same thing Will and I were just talking about. It's good for differentiating what we're talking about. As I said, they operate the same way, but it's fair enough that we want to say what we mean, especially because creationists are familiar with both of those terms. For John and Berger, as a former YEC myself, I'm really looking forward to this. I also had never learned evolution properly, so I never understood it. Once you understand it, it's hard not to have your mind changed. Thank you so much for your donation. We'll see what happens. Again, all on Will.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm also expecting, it might not happen, but I'm expecting to hear a lot from people on the creation side. So I think it's going to be interesting for sure, but I'm going to keep open ears and open mind through all of this.
That's all I ask. We got $4.99. There it is points for being here. YEC is not flat earth. Sucks when you decide to participate in science denial, I guess. Melodic lyrics. I didn't realize that was a little snarky. Sorry for reading that one. Sorry.
That's okay. I will respond to melodic lyrics and say, I can't even find anybody that can define what science denial is. So maybe you could work on that for me.
We got, okay, now I've got to read them closely. All right. I'm going to have to read this one, Will, because this is direct. This is you guys' beef. I'm going to leave this to you guys. So this is Planet Peterson for $100. Hi, Will. I just searched all 3 of my Gmail accounts, including spam. There's no email from you. I'm not calling you a liar, but I definitely don't have an email. Produce a screenshot or something. I also never turned on you because we've never collaborated. I want you guys to. It's hard when somebody super chats $100. I know this is a little snarky, but you guys were also having like this conflict. This is all on you. By all means, converse or don't.
Yeah, give me 1 second. This is actually really important. Do I have the ability to share my screen?
Give it to me and I will share it. Just
Okay,
click share and I will do it.
Okay, awesome. Okay, give me 1 second. I love being called to task. I do it to other people, so it's good.
I want people to have chances to defend themselves and also make their case. So I realize, and now I feel like I need to go back and read Vishanti's super chat because I feel like I've read everything besides hers. It was a little snarky.
Okay, so I think I have to share my screen.
Click share, and I'm just waiting to see it in my little thing down here.
Okay. Okay, give me 1 second before you share it. Oh, here we go.
Just say when. Oh, sorry if everybody heard that burp.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I see it.
So, and then Eric, here's the email that I sent it to, which came straight from your website. So
I don't know where it could have gone. I lose emails constantly, but also I'm not very good at looking for them. And Outlook is just garbage. That's my school email. I can't find anything for the life of me in that.
Yeah, well, hopefully this will. I mean, here's the deal. It's this very simple question, very simple email. So there we go. It's got my email on there as well. So if anybody needs to reach me, that's how to reach me, and hopefully that will get a response from him. Thank you, Eric.
By all means, you guys have a conversation. I think it'd be fun to see. Planet Peterson for $5. I can't stick around, so I'll watch the stream later and reply hopefully tomorrow. Thanks for the shout out. Enjoy 5250. Thank you very much for the donation, Planet Peterson. I do hope that you and Will can have a conversation. I think that would be fascinating to watch. So my pleasure facilitating the connection here.
Hey,
we got $5 from Jarek C. $5. Big props for Will for being able to learn about something he is skeptical about and might make him uncomfortable. That's what I said. I agree. So if you hear that clacking, you can probably see him. He's laying down back there. Taylor Dakar for $5. Your stream brings me so much enjoyment and joy. That's a given. Thank you for all you do and the learning you bring to the world. Cheers. It is, as always, my absolute pleasure. Mostly the super chats are on so that you guys can ask questions if you want to. You do not have to waste money gassing me up. Your comments in the description are enough. All right. I think this is fair enough. This is not snarky. This is a genuine question. Mm-hmm. From Grungy Vidali Gurison for 5115 for $5. Until young Earth creationists can give a method to determine something's created kind, they have no actual alternative to evolution. We touched a little bit on species today, so
yeah,
feel free to respond.
Yeah, I see this as kind of, I don't know. I don't know what they're asking. I could see two things here, like, which is, how are we going to determine what a kind is if you don't like how we categorize species? That I think is completely valid. And I would say that I don't know how creationists determine kind. There might be people out there that have proposed these ideas. I don't know. I would guess that there's going to be issues, just like I pointed out, issues with species. In terms of a method to determine something's created, that's a much bigger question. I will say that if we go to, which is not the topic, but if we go to the origin of life and we go to abiogenesis, what I see is that people who are convinced that there is no God, they don't have a way that life came from non-life, and they just are okay with that because they just don't want to entertain the idea of a God. And so I would say to you, if you don't have an explanation for something, if you don't have a reasonable explanation for something, I think it would be the most honest thing you could do to consider a possibility of God in that situation. And so I think from an origin standpoint, again, not evolution, people should be more open to considering God, since there is not an alternative hypothesis.
If you'd like, at some point, I can send you some links as to how creationists do consider kinds, because
Mm.
I think it does. I think it has a bearing on this conversation, and I do agree with what our chatter here has said. There needs to be a
Cool.
method to determine what is related by descent versus what is related by design. But if you're not familiar with it, you can't really answer this question. So I can
Yeah,
send you some links, and you can maybe, like, from AIG or CMI or ICR or whatever, and you can peruse them in the interim, kind of see what you think.
please send.
We have just $1 from no super chat from Jefferson, not 4357. Thank you very much for the donation.
I've done that before. You accidentally send it before you write it. So
Oh man. Okay. Shoot. Dang it. I wish that hadn't happened. Okay. We have from Prixie Purple for $10. Will, what do you think is going on in the minds of flirfs who didn't change their mind after the final experiment, particularly the ones who went themselves? Do you expect them to change their mind? Why or why not?
sure. We have at least a 50% change of mind with those who went. It might be higher. I'm still waiting on that. The only holdout I know of that's talking about it publicly is Austin Whitsitt, who many people who are watching might know. I think it's to be expected, right? When you do something like this, including with what Erica and I are doing, if somebody is actually looking for truth, so in this situation, I'm claiming to be one actually looking for truth. Jaron Campanella was a flat earther actually looking for truth. When you have somebody actually looking for truth, they're going to be in a situation where when they're presented with the evidence, they're going to accept it, or at least be in a position to accept it. There are people who are unwilling to change their mind regardless of anything. They're not actually looking for truth. They want to hold on to their belief no matter what. And so that's a situation where you're going to have that. And there's obviously flat earthers who are in that position. There's creationists who are in that position. I would say there's theists and atheists in that position. I've talked to people, I don't know who exactly, so I won't mention any names, but I've talked to atheists that have said that they would never believe a miracle, even if they witnessed it themselves. They would just either think that they missaw what they witnessed, or that there's a naturalistic explanation that hasn't been discovered yet. And so I would kind of put all of those in the same category. But again, people have a will. They're going to do what they want to do. And I do think if people are actually looking for truth and they are active about that and diligent about it, they will find it.
Awesome. We got Cranky Pants. Oh, 5W for $5. Gotta run. Great stuff. Thank you for the donation. And hey, rewatch the stream. Don't miss it. It was fun. It was mostly just me talking. Benjamin Kindle, 1841 for $10. Erica's the goat, or should I say the ape? Awesomest person ever. That's very sweet of you. And also, I'm the regular ape. So thank you. We got Timothy Judge 418 for $5. Has Will considered that the Eastern Orthodox Church's Old Testament is Greek? I think that's meant to be Greek, Septuagint, which uses the dates he finds more compelling.
I haven't. So that's fascinating to me. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I actually love history. I was recently in Turkey studying biblical history on location. Then I went over to Greece, studied biblical history on location, went all over the place. Delphi, ended up in Athens. So to me, studying on location, like Darwin did, right, in the Galapagos, is super important. And I learned some things with the Greek Orthodox Church over there that I didn't know, that are super fascinating to me. And all it pretty much does is just open up new areas for me to study and consider. So I appreciate you for bringing this up for me.
That's the best part about learning, is finding out how much more you get to learn.
Yeah, what I've said before is that the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know.
Yeah, no, I feel exactly the same way. It's exciting, though. Yeah, that's the benefit. From Fern Lovebond for $5. Yes, the woman condition. My mother was afflicted, as was her mother. My father avoided the condition, but he was a carrier. It runs in my family. He's talking about Mary Anning, talking about, unfortunately, she was a woman.
Oh, got it.
We got, for Xenocore 01, $2. Give them the fire hose of knowledge. Hopefully that's what he got.
Yeah. So again, like I tell my kids, I'm like, you guys don't have any idea how amazing it is that you have access to information so easily. There's a great quote. I wish I knew it from memory, but there's someone out there that said like information today is so easily accessible, and the desire for it seems to be at an all-time low.
I know what you mean.
It's so sad, right? People used to have to travel maybe to another country to go visit a library to read whatever books they had there. So
And
this is a fire hose. I love it.
Before that, you were lucky to own a book, right? Like right when the Gutenberg printing press hadn't been around for very long. It's like if you didn't have but most people just didn't have them. I mean, you went to places to read, but also most people weren't literate. That's another wonderful privilege that we have. We have the power of Naa for ours. 200 is a Futurama quote. Sorry, Erica, but we will not give in to the thinkers. I cannot speak to you, miss, but my ancestors were not monkeys. They were orangutans, hardworking, patriotic orangutans. From Futurama. Kaleidoscope Green for $5. Thank you. It is our pleasure. Well, I'll speak for myself, but I think Will's having fun. We got Wild World 6264 for €10. Even though I accept the theory of evolution already, I always learn so much from your work. Thanks, Erica, for your presentation, and respect to Will for doing this. Love it. Thanks for everybody being so sweet. We have At Least Forget for $2. Please record and keep this publicly available. I was going to say this at the end, but my plan is to repost this as a separate video as well. I think it's a good conversation to reach as many people as possible, like this whole thing. So my hope is that it'll sort of double boost with the algorithm. It'll probably have like a slightly different thumbnail. We have Inster for 1025, the final experiment 2025, part 2, the final evolution.
I like it.
We've got Joanna Berger for $10. Thank you, Erica and Will, for this. This was wonderfully done. Obviously, I couldn't do it without Will, so glad he's here. We have Gordon Loves Science for $19.99. That was a wonderful history, fascinating evolution of great ideas. Tune in. The recorded version of that was like twice as long. That was the truncated version. We have, let's see. I think this is a fair question that I'm going to ask
Great.
you. Where is Waldo for $5 Canadian? Question for Will. Why is it harder to believe that God used evolution to make us from other apes rather than that he made us from dirt?
Yeah, really good question. I would say this. At this point, I have not exposed myself and learned enough about evolution. And so what I'm hearing is probably a mixture of half-truths and falsehoods. And so my current position rejecting evolution is coming from a lack of knowledge about evolution, which I would call an ignorance of evolution. And so with that said, I mean, obviously, it's not something that can be observed happening over a short period of time. Like you can go online and see a live picture of the Earth from space. And so I think it's going to be, at least where I am right now, the little I know is the reason I don't accept it. But that may change with going through this with Erica. But I do. But obviously, this is an important point that I want to make too, especially for all the people making fun of me. I was shocked. I did not expect this. To prepare for this, Erica, I checked the most recent Gallup poll on evolution, and my position is in the majority. So as it stands, more people believe in young Earth creationism and no evolution than the other two options, which are evolution with God directing it and then completely naturalistic evolution. Now, the naturalistic evolution is increasing and has increased significantly over the past few decades, but I wasn't expecting that. And so I would tell you, the person that sent the super chat, is that if I do come to the conclusion that evolution is true, I suspect that it's going to be something that is designed and utilized by God and not from a completely naturalistic perspective.
Let me provide you a source for this really quick, because I also saw a recent poll, but the results are substantially different from the one that you just said. It's from
Okay.
Pew, so it's not from Gallup, but it's a Pew Research poll. Here, I found it. It's a Pew Research poll that asked on evolution acceptance. And the percentage of people across all religious adults, it was 17% that humans have existed since the beginning of time as is. So a sort of young earth creationist perspective. The naturalistic perspective was 33%. Humans evolved, God had no role. But the overwhelming majority was the 47%. Humans evolved guided by God. So what I find interesting about that is that the theistic evolution perspective has pulled not just from the young earth creationists, but it's also pulled from the naturalistic evolution, at least from Pew. I'll send you the link after with some other useful links, and you can see. I suspect that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle between those two polls, because polls are always, they're limited in where and when they're polling anyways.
For sure.
Okay. We have Templar Warden for $5 New Zealand. Appreciate the lesson, Erica. This is new specific stuff for me too. Will, what was your favorite part of the lesson today?
Yeah, really good question. I think just the history. Understanding the progress of thought is super important. There's a rhyme and a reason for it. Obviously, there's great thinkers of history that came up with ideas that had never before been put forth. And obviously the excitement of just exploring the earth, right? Going to places that no one has ever been, looking at the life, the biological life, and starting to trying to understand it, categorize it. I still wonder how he got so many birds. Getting a bird is not that easy. But yeah, just the history going through time of how we got to where we are today. Now, I will say this, which is that this affects everyone, but there's this idea, I think, that plagues us as humans, which is that we finally figured everything out and we can point out all the problems in the past, but we're right today. And I think that that's a little bit of a scary position to take. And so we always need to just have something there that's like, hey, we feel really good about this. We do see the mistakes other people have made, but where are we making mistakes and where can we learn more?
And that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate to see, given the whole point of science is that it can adapt with new information, right? Like that's the whole utility, is that it can change as new data comes to light. So I hate when I see overconfidence in science, and you see a lot of it. Especially if you keep up with like new publications, people are like, "Oh, we finally figured it out," and it's like, "Oh, really? You and the past 12 guys that published on this same subject." We have $2 from Neurondipits, $2. Thank you both for the positive attitude and lesson. Thank you for being here. From Ernie Matthews for $5 as a listening since you were a 5K creator. Thank you. I'm sorry you had to subject yourself to whatever I was making when I had 5,000 subs. The audio was like through an actual tin can. From James Spetch, $2. Your content improves lives. Gutsy Gibbon. Thank you, homie. It's my pleasure. My favorite thing to do is teach. Really, I love it. So providing that kind of thing to other people is my bread and butter. We have McToon Live for $1.99. Two of the nicest people I know. Love this. Again, Will is a delight to have on. This is fun for me. He asks questions. I get to yap. It's a wonderful situation.
Yeah, MC Toon's a good friend of mine. So thanks so much.
Awesome. We have a Cookies Riot. This person is coming after you for your uniformitarianism take. Uniformitarianism isn't no global flood or meteor. It means we should see the effects if they happen. The flood isn't just not found. All evidence is incompatible. The meteor has evidence all over. We're going to talk a little bit more about this, about geology, when we get to the geology section, because I think that needs to be unpacked. I do agree with what Cookies Riot is saying here, but it's an easy statement. No fault on you, Cookies Riot, because you have a character limit. But it's easy to say stuff like this. Hopefully, we'll be able to get into the bulk of what you're saying here once we talk about geology.
Yeah, I will respond real quick to this person. In terms of the meteor having evidence all over, I personally, now again, I'm open to being wrong on this. I haven't looked into it, but I've actually never even seen a crater. There is someone who I won't mention, but he is highly respected. He's a PhD, and he's told me in private that there is no crater. Now, that's a bold claim. And so whoever sent this super chat, if you want to say that the meteor has evidence all over, I'm curious if you've ever seen a crater, because I've looked and I can't find it. So we'll get there together, Erica.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Chicxulub and what the support is for the impactor hypothesis, because there's more to it, but we'll get there when we get there. I think since I've been reading the not snarky ones, but like this kind of challenging ones, I am going to bring up the shanties from earlier because I feel bad that I literally read every other one.
It's
For
okay.
$10, he says, if you can't address the entire preponderance of evidence, Will Duffy DeFlurf's trying to ad hoc hoping he doesn't do the same to evolution's preponderance of evidence. So what she's saying is that you're
Sure.
good at being like, let's not write off globe Earth because you just want to. And she's saying she doesn't want you to do that too.
Yeah, a preponderance of evidence is super important. That's exactly what we do with forensic science and so many things. Is it's like where does the mountain of evidence point to? So the whole point of me doing this is I want to get the mountain of evidence and then make that decision.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We have scientific origins for $2. Thanks for the free lesson, Erica, for your PhD fund. You guys fund most of what I do by watching my videos. So that's my husband and I both work. So it's like, we're sitting okay, but what you guys do is what keeps the channel lights on. So thank you for that. We have Jake Dapper Inside Joke Nelson for $5. The conversation is what matters. Don't stop. We'll keep asking questions. Yeah, I get delighted every time Will's like, can we stop there for a second? And I'm like, I want to talk about it.
Will do.
We have Port City African-centered intellectuals for $4.99. Can you explain more how Darwin used the early divergence of embryos to explain evolution like the toe? Yes, but I'm actually not going to do that here. So come back, Port City African-centered intellectuals, because we have an entire lecture that's just on ontogeny, which is exactly what you're talking about here, where we're going to go into that in depth. But I will throw you a bone here and give you one. My favorite of the things that sort of develops and then goes away in humans is really early on. We start to develop the sort of ape-like pelvis, and then our pelvic growth plate does like a 90-degree turn. And that's what gives it that short, squat, wide look that allows us to be bipedal. It's really cool. We'll talk about that too. We have from Hawk SX for $5. I'd like to congratulate Will for being open to learn and Erica for being a wonderful presentation. Cheers from Brazil. Again, we're having fun. So thank you for being here. We have another super chat. Okay, where is Waldo? This one is snarky. I'm not reading this one because that's not nice. You're just being antagonistic. Whereas Waldo is not convinced of God's existence. I don't think that you're here to defend God's existence. If you want to, I'm sure there are many places you could do that. You don't need to do it here.
Yeah, I'm more than willing to. So just let me know where you want me to do that, and I will. Just not here. It's off topic.
Thank you for the $5. Whereas Waldo, we did read your other super chats, but you were like 2 non-snarkies, 1 snarky. Okay, we have James' speech for $2. Was that answer not a God of the Gaps answer? I don't know which.
I do.
Okay, take the floor.
Okay, cool. So I'm really glad I can give my thoughts on this. I've noticed that creationists like to push back when they're being accused of God of the Gaps. I take a different approach. I actually think everyone's doing this. So I've coined this term. That does not mean someone else didn't coin it first. I just came up with it. And so it's clearly somebody else may have already done it. But I see atheists do this too. And I call it naturalism of the gaps. And so if they can't explain something, they just say, well, we haven't figured it out yet, but there has to be a natural way and we will figure it out. That's naturalism of the gaps versus God of the gaps. So I don't have an issue with this. And here's why. Again, in the pursuit of truth, let's just say hypothetically, there is a God and he did create the universe. Okay. If you're going to start your pursuit of knowledge by stating that I'm not going to accept there's a God and I never will, then what you're essentially doing is saying that everything you're going to go try to figure out, you're setting yourself up for failure. So I think people should take the position of, if there was a God, if there is a God, and if he did create the universe, I want to know that, versus I'm going to try to explain everything away. and get to an extreme position of not having any naturalistic explanation for something and saying, it doesn't matter to me, I'm not willing to consider God. That to me is not the best position to take.
I'm going to add this one onto that because it's sort of the same concept. From the
Okay.
power of Nuh-uh, 200 ARS dollars. My issue with consider God is that people who say it usually assume that it's the God they like for no discernible reason, or they decide to call something vague God and use that equivocation to link it with their favorite deity.
Sure. So I'm not here to say that any particular person or whatever has everything exactly right about God. This is a bit philosophical, but we're going back to consider, number one, can something come from nothing? I'm not saying that that's what people's positions are, even though it was Stephen Hawking who actually did take that position. We're going back to say, could this universe and the world we live in and the life we see happen without a God? The idea of a first uncreated being is something that's believed by a lot of people and has been throughout history. I do believe that the evidence is overwhelming that God exists, but in terms of specific details about God, I am more than willing to admit I'm sure I have a lot of them wrong. Just look at all of the different denominations and theologies just in Christianity itself. We're all trying to figure out who God is, what his attributes are, but we're all in agreement in terms of this uncreated creator and this all-powerful being that we are describing. So I'm not trying to be vague, but hopefully that makes sense.
I'm sure that you have talked about your thoughts on all that like elsewhere, so feel free to gesture anybody over there or set up conversations with folks to talk about that. I mean, I'm interested in your perspective for sure, but I just don't have much to add on these. Plus, they're directed at you anyway, so I get to
Okay.
just punt and run. We have minty goose juice for $5. Have you heard of the Gospel of Judas or Gnosticism? I'm assuming that's for you.
Yeah, I have heard of the Gospel of Judas. I haven't read it. I've heard of Gnosticism. I think Gnosticism is alive and well. It gets people into trouble. It probably gets me into trouble. It definitely gets flat earthers into trouble. There's something about humans, and I don't know what it is, but when we think we have special knowledge and new information that no one else has, it like makes us feel special and that everybody needs us. And so we go out and we're trying to like convince people of it. But where the issue comes into play is when you want to hold on to this thing that's giving you importance and it's making you feel like people will need you and accept you, is holding on to that too long after you've been shown, hey, this is completely false. Conspiracy theories are so prevalent today. And after Flat Earth, I have now like a visceral reaction to conspiracy theories. And so if people bring them up to me, my gut reaction is actually push back against them. And what I've learned was to value time. I think time is one of our most valuable assets as human beings. And so if somebody wants to bring a conspiracy theory to me, I'm going to hear what it's about. And I'm just usually going to say, I don't even care. It's not worth my time. So I end the conversations there.
I think that that's a good way to be, because if we went down the rabbit hole with every single conspiracy theory, especially because a lot of times, I don't know what your experience is, but a lot of times it ends up being bad faith in the ones that I'm going down. And then it's like, okay, now I feel like you've wasted my time on purpose when you never really were interested in the truth of it, which can be really frustrating. Okay, we have for $10 from Rich Simpkins. I think this is an interesting one. Catholics acknowledged the legitimacy of evolution back in the 50s as more than a theory. In the 90s, Augustine said people laughed at creationism in the 6th century. Can't we get past it? I will say here, Rich, Augustine did not laugh at creationism. He laughed at a literal interpretation of Genesis, and he didn't really laugh at it. He had like a different perspective on it. I do think it's important to point out that early church fathers had non-literal interpretations of Genesis too, though. So to that point, you are correct. But yes, the Catholics are generally pretty comfortable with evolutionary theory these days. But I think that's because they botched it so royally with heliocentrism.
Yeah, one thing I will add is something that I've been doing is I've been trying to look, and again, I got this from Flat Earth. Like I learned a lot in the whole final experiment thing. But I I now look at something, and if there's an issue out there that does have experts on two sides and a significant amount of experts, that to me is something that I need to look into more in any area of life. It could be on diet, it could be on vaccines, it could be on evolution. And so the fact that, again, Flat Earth has zero of this, they don't have anything, they have nothing, no experts, no scientists, no pilots, no PhDs, they have nothing. And there's a reason for that. But again, it's fascinating to me, and I'm going to learn more, which I'm excited to learn. But it's fascinating to me that we still have hundreds of PhDs that are young Earth creationists, and so there must be a reason why, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it.
I want you to get to the bottom of it as well. I have my own hypothesis, but and it's probably not very nice, but that's okay. We have Xandor for $5. Big difference between species and kinds, as species are semi-arbitrary as category systems, and kinds are very real biological categories. Problems. I'm not really sure what they're saying here. I think this might be. I think what they're saying is that kinds are proposed to be real biological categories and species are not. Which, because that's what I was saying when I was like, the sort of arbitrary nature of species would be expected if everything kind of bleeds into one another. If that's what you're saying, Xandorf, I agree with you here. But we will get into that more later. A lot of what we've talked about today are sort of introducing topics that we don't have time to go into because we can't stream for 12 hours. You'd have to be crazy to do that. The power of Na'ah for R's $100. Ignorance is an active participle. Excuse me. You have to purposefully do it. You are not ignorant while you're learning. I think that's true. And the number of things I'm ignorant on is infinite.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I wasn't using the term as willful ignorance, more so just the kind of standard definition of not having the information at the moment.
We have for Dr. Nimrod for €2 and 49 euro cents. I don't know what the euro cent is. I'm happy that Will is willing to learn. Well done. I'm glad he's here too. Andrew Beatty 3870 for $5. I appreciate the ardent desire for truth. Personally, it drove me to atheism and evolution, but you must decide for yourself. That's true. You got to reach your own conclusions. All we can do is do our best to understand the situation. Scientific origins for $2. The history showed me species fixity is busted. Yeah, species fixity does not work. Fortunately, that actually is something that, at least with modern creationists, we all agree on, is that species can change. The question is, how much can they change? Okay, from Where is Waldo? Okay, I hope Will is not offended. I'm not trying to be snarky. You wouldn't have read any of my comments. Will agree to do this publicly. Respect. Okay, Where is Waldo? We're good. We're good, my friend. Sorry I busted you publicly for that. It was you were just coming on a little strong with the one of them. The rest were good. We have Cheetah X for €100. Holy moly. Thank you, Will, for being so bold and humble. Power through. It'll be a lot. It'll shake your foundation, but you'll come out better on the other end. I hope at the very least, Will is just like, this is very interesting that people are considering the data this way. That's all I can present.
Something else people should know is I'm not just doing this. I'm actually having my kids watch this as well. So I'm letting them get the same education I am. Obviously, they're not going to understand it to the same level, but this is not something that I'm hiding from them. There's no reason we shouldn't fear investigation. We shouldn't fear facts and evidence. I'm really excited about this for me and everyone else that's going to benefit from this.
Yeah, I think it's regardless of how things conclude, at the very least, I think it's exactly how I would prefer if people settled disagreements. It's just by like learning how each other thinks and why they think that, and then coming to a conclusion within reason, I should say. We have Fair and Solace for $9.99. Do you think ERV is present? I think this one's for me. Present in the human genome is tantamount to the heat problem with the global flood. I hope the gist of my question is sensible, strength of evidence, etc. I don't do the ERV thing as much as like Dan does or some of the other sort of evolution content creators online. I think ERV is pretty solid. It wouldn't be the one that I would go with, but my understanding is that there isn't a way to understand endogenous retroviruses without appealing to some pretty specific as far as we know, non-existent mechanisms, but we'll see. Obviously, I love the heat problem. That's my go-to. But I think the heat problem is a good argument to use, in my opinion, against creationism, because I think it is it's very bombastic. I'm sure Will is familiar with it, but if not, we'll talk about it at some point. We have the power of Na'a for 100 R's dollars. Actually visited Progresso right next to Chicxulub within the crater. The area is full of cenotes. Oh yeah, cenotes, caves made from the impact. There are similar ones in Africa around another huge crater. I've never been to a cenote, but I've heard they're really cool. Oh, cool. Parker M. Taylor for $9.99. No question here, just supporting a bud doing good work. Parker is an IRL friend of mine. Thank you for being here, Parker, and I love your profile pic. Okay, we're getting close to being done. From Quantum Chaos for $5 Canadian. I just got here, so I have nothing of value to add to the conversation. I just wanted my moment in the spotlight. Hi there. Hello. Quantum Chaos, 15 minutes of fame are yours. on this one, like, moderately sized YouTube channel. Congratulations. James Pesh for $1. Again, nothing. James, you've gotta like send a super chat that I can actually answer your question. Maybe you're doing it on purpose. I don't know. Okay. And I can't keep track of the chat and do super chats at the same time. So I don't know what to say. Super chat better, my friend. From Darth Smack 7090 for $10. Hopefully you share a mind-blown revelation like the Flurf dude during the final experiment. The universe is an amazing place. Again, I would love it if Will finished this and was like, I love evolution now. We'll see what happens. From Bob Null for $10. Happy November. Marie Curie, Edward Haley, James Clerk Maxwell, and Carl Sagan were born this month. On the Origin of Species was published in November 2. I always feel very science-y this time of year. I did not know that all those people were born in November. That is news to me. Okay. I think that this is a genuine question. I don't think this is meant to be snarky. I do think it's a little antagonistic, but I think you can handle it. Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay. From Patsox 2004, plus now we've basically read every question. Will, don't you see a problem that your physicist friend can't publicly say there is no crater? If he has evidence or a cogent argument as to why there is no crater, he should just say it publicly.
Okay, cool. So he's a geologist. And I'm just being careful and respectful. I do this with everybody I come in contact with, even Erica. If something is discussed privately, I will get their explicit permission first to say it publicly, just in case. So I'm just being careful and respectful so that I don't ruin relationships and burn bridges. But we're going to be talking about it, so I'll reach out to him for sure.
Yeah, we'll come back. We'll circle back to this exact topic. The next question is in the same vein. Or not question, but statement from Angus 42 for £2 was shouting iridium layer for global FX. We will talk about iridium. We'll talk about the impact fracture patterns that we find and things of that nature. And we're going to get to that in a couple months, though, probably. So hold your horses. We're going to get there eventually. For Dredemi for $2 or for $2. Great dialogue, y'all. Very diplomatic and chill. I thought it was great too. I had a blast. From Tat is Mad for $5. As somebody who goes down the rabbit hole on every conspiracy theory I hear about, it will absolutely make you insane. Love the lesson and chat. Yeah, I've only made that mistake 100,000 times getting into a conversation about a conspiracy theory. Okay, Xandor for $2. Correct WRT to species versus kinds. That's a given. Will, thoughts? I think we covered this one already. I think they were just fixing the typo. Xandorf, if we didn't, let us know.
Okay.
I think this was the kinds question, like kinds versus species.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have Clippy LeClipster. This is snarky, Clippy. They basically are Clippy the Clipster for $5 is basically saying that your homework assignment is to write a paragraph summarizing what you learned. I don't think Will needs to do that, Clippy. Will's got it.
I'll be reviewing.
Yeah, he'll be. The McIke for $5 to quote Penn Jillette. All you have to be able to say is I don't know to a question to force you to question your beliefs. That's true. And questioning your beliefs is a good thing. You either end up confirming what you previously thought or you learn something new and then you're less wrong. Aegis 42 for £5, showing your kids is the key. Indoctrination is child abuse. Huge respect, Will. Seriously. Yeah, I think that's awesome. We have scientific origins for $2. Will should get in touch with Ken Wolgamith. I actually already have some of Ken's slides that will show up later in this series. Hopefully, Ken is really lovely.
I don't know him.
I will give you his contact information because I think he would be okay with. I'll ask him if I can give you his contact information first. He's an old Earth creationist that I've had speak on this show before. He's really cool. He's done some cool work. Okay, Zach Morgan for 1999. Last super chat, I think this is the last one that I have. Being sweet, Erica's the best inspiration to us all. I hope my daughter grows up to be just like you. That's very kind of you. I don't know what to say. Thank you. I think that is all we have. Let me double check. Zip over to yep, that's it. Okay, folks, that's the end of the stream. Thank you so much for being here. Will, do you have anything you want to top us off with?
No, I do want to state that, again, I'm just super thankful for this. I think this is how conversation should happen. I think this is how people should do research. I'm now at a point in my life where I'm more interested in finding where I'm wrong versus trying to show people where they're wrong. I don't know if that comes with age. For me, it has. When I was young and on fire, I just wanted to show everybody where they were wrong and I was right. And I wanted to debate everybody and prove everybody wrong. But now that I've got kids and I'm older, it's like, wait a minute, I'm not right about everything. That's the one thing I know for sure. And so I want to figure out where I'm wrong. And I want to go about it in a way where I'm going to get the best information. I'm going to hear it from the horse's mouth. And so that's why I'm here. And I hope everybody's excited to do this journey with us together.
Yeah, this is going to be awesome. I'm beyond excited to get in. We got the history stuff. I love the history stuff, but it's not as fun as the actual science stuff. So I'm really excited to get to talking about that. And we'll see you probably around this time next month. So come on back. We'll have another awesome little powwow. And it's going to be great. And hopefully I'll say more controversial stuff. So Will stop me more often. And I will create a much shorter PowerPoint too. So thank you guys for being here. And from the bottom of my gentle, of course, very modern heart, I'll see you next time. Take care. Ending the stream.